We're going to get started with tonight's meeting. So we'll start off with the council meeting follow-up, prostitution ordinance amendment. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, good evening. Pursuant to our conversation last meeting, the Attorney's Office has been working on definitions that would help the discussion pertaining to in-person type activities that would ordinarily be considered prostitution and so on. And so with that, the Attorney's Office has some language to suggest that could help in this matter. And with that, Mr. Mayor, if I might defer to the attorney, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Henley?
Great. Thank you, City Manager. Thank you, Mayor. As I understand it, there was a question last meeting about the definition of basically performance prostitution and whether or not that might affect the ability of film companies or the like from distributing their products. And certainly it wasn't, at least our intention when we were drafting this originally, that that would have any such effect. You know, we were looking basically at some type of sexual trafficking deterrent here in our jurisdiction and prostitution deterrent here in our jurisdiction, but nothing with that intention. So to make that absolutely clear within the ordinance, we have a proposed amendment that's before you. Basically, we would just say that for performance prostitution, all of the participants, whether they be the toucher or the touchee, or the person who's paying the toucher or touchee, to be in the same building area, vehicle, or structure. And that would make sure that, you know, some off-premise filming company wouldn't be entangled with this or think that they might become entangled with this. So if that is accurate, if I understood kind of the question accurately, that's what you have before you now. And I think that would be what you would want to maybe just visit with a little bit about tonight to make sure that that fits the bill on what you wanted to have done. And then when we go into the next meeting, you'll have this prepared and someone will have to make the amendment in the second and get that changed out. And then hopefully on the third reading, the ordinance would be passed and could go into law.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Councilman Gamera.
I think I want to open my mouth again about this. So yeah, thanks for, you weren't at the last meeting, and so I guess since I was the one that brought it up, I'd just like to clarify. I wasn't thinking so much film studios, it was more just streaming of online content. There's various mediums or platforms or applications that people can use to stream content. And so that's what I was worried about, is people within the confines of their own home, you know, using their phone or their webcam or whatever to stream content. I guess this does seem to address that issue specifically, but I don't know if I'm the only one that, I don't, you know, I'm not an expert in legalese, and I haven't gone over this proposed ordinance like with a fine-tooth comb yet, and so it seems like it addresses my concerns, but again, it's one of those things that could have unintended consequences. I just don't know. It seems like we're kind of creating this from the ground up, and I'm wondering if other communities have maybe come up with some very, you know, they've already gone through the trial and error period that we are, you know, emerging into, and have a more refined language that they're using in their ordinance. But it does seem to address the concern I brought up last week. Thank you.
We've had, obviously, we've had the prostitution ordinance on the books for quite a few years, and we've made changes to it over the years to fit what was going on at the time. I think personally the biggest question was, does this go outside of physically being in front of one another, making things happen online or whatever it might be? And I feel like the way this is worded does. It does, in fact, it talks about one person to another physically in front of each other. So I don't have a problem with it. I think that this personally answers what you brought up last week. So, Councilman Cathy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Did you run this by the police chief?
I did, Councilman, and indeed we actually had a couple of options that we were looking at. And I looked at one that we had drafted originally, and it seemed to me like it was deficient in how it was drafted. And so I modified it and then modified it again. And this is the one that the police chief felt would be the better of the ones, or the best of the three.
Very good, because I know when we initially started down this road to modify it, that was trying to satisfy the concerns that he had, and I didn't want to water down what we had, so that was why I was asking if he was still on board with it. Thank you, Chief.
Yep.
Thank you.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Henley, is there a reason that we are choosing to get so broad as to say building and structure versus just room?
You know, that was kind of what I was looking at with that first ordinance, that it was too narrow, because then I thought, well, someone will put up a window wall, and so, or someone will put up a rice paper wall, and say, well, we really weren't violating this, but still we'll have the problems of the sexual trafficking, as well as then the variety of actions that can happen in that circumstance. So we tried to make it where it would have to be visually at the same area, but you couldn't get around it simply by putting up some type of a plexiglass wall or a window wall or something like that, and having the legal argument that it really wasn't the same room because the room's separated by a firm structure. And so that really is the case. We did start off with exactly that. So, but we narrowed, or we broadened it a little bit, and maybe that's just kind of the prosecutor's mind, that the criminal, practicing the criminal law a little bit, that these things will come up, and there's money to be made. And so we thought, well, let's just make it so that it fits the visual aspect. And so if it's in a building, if it's in a structure, if it's in a car, if they're outside, you're going to try to take care of it.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. So we'll just need to bring this up as an amendment in the next meeting. Okay? All right. Can we go ahead and move that agenda item up? All right, so we're going to move number 5 up next, because we do have a couple council members that need to leave this evening early. So we'll go over the liquor license renewal and police report discussion. Mr. City Manager. Is it, I guess, Councilmember Pollock, is it good for her to be here, or should she remove herself during this discussion?
I would think that probably, given the breadth of this and the fact that you do sell to a variety of operators within the city, this would be an appropriate time probably to declare a conflict of interest because of that, and then to pursuant to the conflict of interest rule, to actually absent yourself while we're discussing this.
Great, thanks. I will do that.
Okay.
Is it not true, as long as she doesn't involve herself in the conversation, she doesn't need to leave the room? She just has to state that there's a conflict and then just not engage in any of the discussion.
Mr. City Attorney.
To the rules.
Actually, we had this incredible discussion the last session, and we had, some concerns from a particular individual or several individuals about the conflict of interest rules, and so we tried to up them quite a bit. And within that, we did talk about if in fact there was a conflict of interest, and we had found some language, that there's some that will mandate that, some that won't, but we did go with the more strict requirement that they actually have to absent themselves from the room if they're declaring a conflict of interest. And they may have some type of personal financial interest that could be. And the appearance of conflict, correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the purpose for tonight's review is really for information purposes, for you to see what it is the conduct of your vendors was over the past year. And if indeed there are some pieces of information or folks you'd like to visit with or whatever in preparation for the formal consideration of this report and the subsequent renewal motion, we would be ready in order to make that happen for you. So we're presenting some information to you that really is bifurcated in two parts. First of all, the performance issues as it relates to the vendors and police activity and those kinds of things. And then a bit of a follow-up, if you will, with regard to the first year of implementing our late submission policy and how that worked out and what some results of that policy implementation was. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, if I can defer to the chief, and then after that, the city clerk, I'd appreciate it.
Chief?
Mayor, council, thank you for this opportunity to give some clarification to the alcohol license report that you have in front of you. Overall, the impression that I would tell you is that 2020 is going to be in every statistical category involving public safety an absolute aberration. There is no real way to correlate the advent of COVID-19, how it's impacted our retailers, how it's impacted law enforcement, our calls for service. It's going to be just one of those years we got to chalk it up and learn from. So the overall impressions that I would give you is, first and foremost, according to our operations, our compliance operations, there's no real statistical difference. This year was an improvement over last year in the singular category of we didn't have retailers failing twice, so everybody was a one-time failure. When it comes to the overall impression of the subsequent pages of that report, the things that I would draw your attention to is the obvious impact of COVID-19. Perhaps one of the best indicators of how that has impacted our community, our retailers, and our police department is the difference in the calls for police services at the event center went down by 64%, and that's a direct reflection of the fact that we just didn't have concerts, we didn't have events going on at the event center. So likewise, all of our hotel establishments that have on-site liquor licenses, every one of those showed a commensurate approximately 40 to 50% reduction in calls for police services. Many of the packaged liquor stores that we have in town, almost all of those showed significant increases. Again, on the range of 40 to 50%, some of them even more than that. So as people migrated from their traditional watering hole, if you will, to packaged liquor stores by which they could drink at home, that was directly impacting our packaged liquor stores, and some of them saw dramatic increases in the amount of times that police officers were summoned to the scene there. If, for the most part, with a couple of notable exceptions, if you were a restaurant with a restaurant liquor license, every one of those dropped significantly, with a couple of exceptions. There were some that kind of stand out, but not in so many numbers that it was a concern to the police department. So overall, what I'm trying to convey to you, COVID absolutely had an impact. It's hard for me to stand before you and say that 2019's change that we did to our ordinance is bearing fruit right now, because the statistical anomaly that we have with COVID-19 is not allowing for any direct realistic comparison from one year to the next. We're gonna have to get another year under our belts before we decide if what we did went far enough or was effective or was too far. When it comes to well, I think that's a pretty good synopsis of the report, Mayor, and so I would then submit to any questions that council may have.
Councilman Cassie.
I had one question. I noticed that on several of the individual establishments, there were traffic listed as one of the reasons for the call. What did that mean? Because are you picking up speeders in the parking lot of the liquor store?
So, Mayor, Councilman Kathy, that's an excellent question, and forgive me for not pointing that out up front. The report that you have involves everything that the police dealt with at the location or immediately in front of the location. And so you're asking yourself, why does that matter? Well, you know, when people are, say they've consumed too much and they pull out into oncoming traffic, that can result in a traffic stop. If the patrons are chronically disobeying traffic laws, coming in and out, that draws police attention to it. Some of the things are as simple as they don't really care about the quality of their alarm, and it forces us to respond there for false alarms. So this is not an absolute whittling down to what are the ones that are absolutely indicative of an overserved patron or something like that. This is the totality of how much trouble they and their location may be causing us. You would see obviously that the number one generator of calls for service is going to be one of our Walmarts on CY Avenue. That goes without saying. There are a lot of people go into that establishment, and so some of it is a direct reflection of problems there related to alcohol. Some of it's just the nature of a lot of people there.
If I can just add to what you were just saying, traffic stops themselves. If officers make a traffic stop and it's in front of a business, they'll call out at that business and it'll go down in the CAD system as the address for that business. So it doesn't mean it generated from there, it came from there. It could be, it just happened to be that's where the officer made the traffic stop at, so.
And that's what I was curious about, so yeah, okay.
Yep.
Is that also true of like some of the hotels I noticed had some pretty wacky calls? That doesn't necessarily mean it was generated from their alcohol part of it. It's just tied into the hotel.
Mayor, Council, that's absolutely correct. Make no mistake about it. This is not a direct reflection of the performance of the alcohol license. This is more of an understanding of how much time police are spending in that business or in the area of that business. Now, you can draw some parallels to how they manage the flow of alcohol in their establishment. You can make some inferences. I am not in any way, shape, or form presenting to you today numbers that, oh yeah, this is a problem. Overall, my message is none of our establishments throughout the year in its entirety rose to an egregious notice to the police department. So 3 years ago, I stood before council and said, I definitely have a problem. There is not somebody standing out in this group of their use of the city-granted liquor license is causing us trouble. That is not the case this year. None of them have risen up to that level to draw police attention.
Any other questions from council? So Chief, if I'm hearing you right, none of them as far as alcohol violations have risen up. Are there any of these establishments in here that you feel would need to, for lack of following the rules, would need to come in front of council to maybe talk to us about some things that are going on or not?
So Mayor, I appreciate the question. When it came to our alcohol compliance operations, most of those were pretty vanilla in their nature. There was one that stood out that was egregious in my opinion for an actual type of a violation, and that was one where under the direct and immediate adjacent supervision of a manager, a 15-year-old sold alcohol to our minor during that operation. And when we investigated that, we learned that since her date of hire, that had been the practice. So under the direct supervision of management, a complete and utter disregard for the state laws that govern the sale of alcohol in such an establishment, and everybody was kind of on the opinion, oh, I didn't know that was a problem. We found that to be somewhat incredulous. So that was an egregious one that we felt was a disregard of the intent of our city ordinances and the reflective state statutes. When it comes to some of our establishments, I felt did exceptionally well, Mayor, so I want to answer conversely. For example, Old Chicago, who has maintained a fairly brisk business during this time of COVID, they dropped 73% in their calls for service. That's a good example of, I think, an establishment that is trying to accomplish the right thing through server training, tip certification, and corporate policy. Did I answer your question, sir?
I think so, yes.
Is it safe to assume that that's been addressed? You're one that stands out to you. I'm assuming it's been addressed and it's not an issue anymore?
Mayor, Councilman, it's still under adjudication. You know, whether or not corporate policy is changed, time will tell.
Okay. Councilman Cathy.
The one thing that I noted was there was, on the alcohol compliance summary, there was one establishment in there that had 2 violations for selling to a minor within a month of each other. Have they, it's on page 63 of our packet. It was on page 3 of, but yeah, they were cited on 11/14 and then again on 12/21 for sale to a minor. And I was wondering, have they got the message or?
Mayor, Council, I owe Council an apology. I scanned through that and I didn't see that I did have a double failure. So just a few minutes ago, I reported there were no double failures. I was completely wrong on that. I'm completely embarrassed. That's still a decline from last year. We did have, we had 2 establishments last year that failed twice on those, and, you know, just by way of full disclosure, every licensed establishment in Casper should know that about the mid-month of November, that our funding comes in to conduct these things. So all of them should know and be well aware that for the last 6 weeks of the year, we're there. We're going to show up, and they should be informing their staff. So from the point of view of public safety, we're disappointed every time that there's a failure because it's kind of predictable. They absolutely should know that they should be sitting their staff down and going, hey, it's the last 6 weeks of the year. The police are going to come twice. And so when they still fail, it feels, you know, our obvious concern is if they fail knowing that we're coming, what's happening when they don't know, you know, when they're not expecting it during the other times of the year, the busy summer months, you know, when things are picking up. So I apologize for the mistake on my part of not catching that.
Oh, I'm not worried about that, but now hearing what you just told me, that they should have known that they were going to be coming at least twice, and they failed both of them, that really starts to make me wonder, like you said, what are they doing the rest of the year? So I guess that then concerns me.
And Councilman Cathy, on that, maybe the clerk could help us out, but I believe that establishment, didn't we just redo their liquor license for a new owner? I believe it just switched hands. Yeah, so,
Okay.
yeah, it may be under new ownership now. Okay, any other questions or comments of the chief? Okay, thank you. Oh, we're not done yet.
If you want to be, you can be done. Your Honor, members of council. So I'm just going to speak very briefly about the liquor license renewal date. So I just wanted to report that that was a huge success this year. Some of you may remember, and others are new to it, but we, in the last year, changed our renewal dates. So previously, we had a renewal date that we would send out stuff, and we'd let people know when that renewal date was. Now we put it in our ordinance that it's going to be the second Monday of December. And this year, when we sent out the renewals, we let them know, we also let them know when the ordinance changed and had that communication ahead of time. Council also put in a sliding scale for late fees. So if you're 1 to 5 days late, it's a $250 charge. If you're 6 to 10 days late, it's a $500 charge. And on day 11, your liquor license, you lose it. And that it was very successful. Council did a great job with putting that in the ordinance because we did not have anybody who lost their liquor license because they were so late. If you, in the memo, you see that there are 4 who had to pay a late fee. All of them acknowledged that they were going to be late and were going to pay the fee. So it wasn't a surprise. They all knew that. And then there were 4 who abandoned their licenses. They knew they weren't going to renew. They acknowledged it and they said, we're not turning in an application. So they're going to lose it this year. Our staff consists of Carla, who's our liquor licensing specialist, and she did send out those letters ahead of time. She emailed, she called, because this was the first year, to make sure everyone knew, and we didn't have those people who said, oh, we didn't know the ordinance changed. So she did a lot of that work ahead of time, and it really did help. So thank you all for that. And that's basically all I have to report on. As you can see, Ludovico did not renew at Talon, and they're going to be moving up to Gruner Brothers, and you all heard that already. That came to council, so those are the only items I had to follow up on, unless you have any questions on anything else in the memo.
Any questions for the clerk? Okay, thank you. Okay, any discussion from council? Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Just a couple comments. I think, thanks Chief for the update on whether it might have been related to pandemic or not. Things seem to be a little bit less crazy out there, so we appreciate that update. I know we're going to talk about maybe possibly having some people come in, and I do have to go because I have my daughter's playing basketball and my son's birthday's today, so I'm going to be leaving here shortly. So I want to just very quickly address Travis Taylor and his license. I think we definitely, number one, need to have him come in and speak in front of us at our council meeting for that. I think it's imperative only because I believe, has it been 2 or 3 years, Carter? 2 years, that he has continued to say that he is going to do something with that liquor license, and it has been shelved. And I believe that is, he stood here before us and said that he was going to do something. He had a whole plan. I know that the video probably exists, so of him saying that to us. Nothing has been done with that, and it's just sitting there, and it's not doing anybody any good. And I think we need to ask him some hard questions as to why the last 2 years he has done absolutely nothing with that license. And so I want to put that out there and understand what he is doing and why he's not utilizing that. When he had promised that he was going to have something up and going in a few months, I want to say, if anybody remembers that conversation. So anyway, I wanted to make sure that was on the record that we should bring him in and have him have a conversation with us.
Councilman Nell.
Just a question. Our liquor licenses, aren't they for life as long as they're in compliance and paying their fees? What does it matter to us whether they use it or they don't? If it's theirs, it's theirs. Is that not true? So why do we need a report from him as long as he's paying for the license and there's no violations against it? I believe he owns that license, and it's up to him to, as long as he's paying his fees, to do whatever he wants. I'm asking.
Mr. Henley?
That would be incorrect. They are city licenses. We let them have the licenses. They have to renew every year. In his particular case, in anybody's case, they get the license. They have a year to either use it or lose it under the current statute. Under the old statute, they had 2 years. So he actually obtained his license back in 2016, and he didn't do anything with it. And in 2017, I think he had some other difficulty in that maybe he was going through a divorce and it was a joint ownership, and so he had to get rid of it, and he came in and didn't use it at all. And then there was another, and so he had 3 years where there was absolutely the doors open, not a bit. And then he said, we're going to do this big establishment, and I need to have some bigger property because it's going to be such a big operation or the like. And as it turns out, he just went in and put it in the old commissary mall, and he has a liquor license there, establishment there. He does have it staffed a certain amount of the time, and but I don't even believe he has a refrigerator there for cold beer. To my knowledge, when I've at least looked in, there's no refrigeration there. And so he has basically shelved it without actually shelving it. And in addition, the state statutes provide that when they go for renewal, that the city council can in fact not renew if in fact the purposes of the license aren't being met, and that the needs of the vicinity under construction are either overutilized or underutilized. The desires of the residents of the city won't be met or satisfied by the renewal. And so there are some pretty broad terms there that that would mandate that they have to be on guard a little bit and try to actually utilize their license. And that's the question, I think, with Mr. Taylor. And I don't know what the circumstances are there, but because I think he has two other establishments, one out in Evansville and I think one over in the Glen Rock area. And so, I mean, he certainly, probably has the expertise, but why the one here in Casper has not, there's really been very little effort as best I can tell.
Well, just so you understand where my question came from, there are communities in Wyoming that once you have a liquor license, it's yours, and you can actually sell it. You can hang on to it. It's yours to do with as you please. I didn't realize we had an ordinance here that was different from that. That was my question. So with that said, now I understand.
Well, and actually that, if you have a license, we're not going to renew, we're not going to pull it back. And in fact, they are sold quite frequently, even our licenses here in the city. And so, because they have to pay an inordinate amount of money, that the council has said, we're going to certainly permit the transfer of those, assuming that the purposes of the statute and the purposes of the ordinance are complied with. There was, in fact, back in, before 2017, a state statute that said that the existing owners had a preference upon renewal. And that was repealed, though, by the legislature. And there's still a little bit of ambiguous language in that regard, but the actual statement that there was a preference for the existing owner has been actually removed from the statute. So I think that a lot of the liquor dealers are now much more cognizant of their obligations to the city and to the city's citizens. And so that the question here is, we have this license for the use of the city's residents to promote competition, to promote variety. Is it actually being used for those purposes or not? And so, that'll be something that maybe if we bring him in, he can explain what his options are and what's going on. And so I understand why Councilman Pacheco would want to maybe do that, because he's been around for all of these explanations, and it really has been a number of years now since this license was purchased by Mr. Taylor and his, I think, probably spouse originally, and been held by Mr. Taylor for 4 or 5 years without much activity at all.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, and just to quickly bring that, and I'm glad you asked that, Bruce, and that it was a great question, and I appreciate the explanation for that, John. I think part of it is that I remember him coming and having the conversation with us and asking us for an extension by saying, hey, I need some more of this, and we were obligated. We were saying, yes, absolutely. We'll work with you and want to do that, and it's just kind of sat there, and I think it needs to be out there to help with the economy. It needs to help be part of the competition, and I think we need to be able to do that, and I'd like to hear his explanation of why he has not utilized this yet. And I feel, and I know I've been here, and I know Sean's been here long at the same time I have, I'm losing my patience with this. And I'll make that abundantly clear with Mr. Taylor next week as well. So that's where I'm sitting on it. So I'm hoping you guys will support me on bringing him forward to give us an update on that. Thank you.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. Forgive me, I'm a bit naive when it comes to this sort of stuff, but my understanding of the liquor licenses is that there's a finite amount that we've set, and I see that 4 establishments chose to abandon theirs, and so my question is, how many available liquor licenses do we have? Is he taking up a license that would otherwise be used for economic development or activity, because that would be important to, because it costs an amount of money to, whether he's shelving it, doing the thing at the commissary mall and doing nothing with it. He paid, what does it cost every year to renew it? Out of curiosity? I'm sorry, I'm like asking multiple questions now.
Mayor, it's $1,500.
Oh, okay. I thought it'd be a lot more than that. But I guess that is one question I have is how many available are there? Thank you.
Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Gamroth, with respect to that particular category of licenses, there are none available in terms of what could be, you know, signed out by, with the city and so on.
Thank you.
Councilman Cassidy.
Something that goes along a little bit further, which Vice Mayor Pacheco alluded to, was the economic development part of it, is that back when we got our extra liquor license because of population, there was actually presentations made by several people, one of them being Yellowstone Garage, Gaslight Social, and I think 3 others. And basically, that was the last one that we had of a full retail license. And even to get the Gaslight Social, their license, they actually went to one of the hotels here in town, convinced them to get a resort license so they could turn around and buy their retail liquor license. So there is a demand for businesses that want these licenses and are looking for them. And we don't want them to wind up trying to be somebody's retirement account, or if an anti-alcohol, I can't think of the right term, but anyhow, if they were to come along, in theory, if we didn't have something along these lines, they could start buying up these liquor licenses, and you would not have a retail liquor establishment in the city of Casper. So that's kind of where all of it comes from, and a little bit of the history that goes back even a couple of years before Ray and Sean were on council. So that's kind of where all of this came from, and I think I was on council when we made some of those changes that they had to be, first time around, when they had to be in operation for X number of hours and all of that to try to stop some of this parking, because I think at that time there were 3 or 4 of them that were parked. And so, you know, we had businesses wanting them, so it was time to do something to get them back into circulation. I think that was pre your time too, I believe, Carter. Yeah.
That was during Prohibition, wasn't it, Mayor?
I'm not that old. Oh, just.
Any other comments or questions from council? Okay, the only comment that I would have is to add to having Mr. Taylor come in is that I believe that, and the chief can correct me if I'm wrong, but the violation he was talking about with the juvenile being involved dealt with Pizza Ranch. And along with that, throughout this entire pandemic that we've been dealing with since March of last year, they have been in constant violation, and we have received numerous complaints about that establishment itself. So I would like to have the manager, the area manager for Pizza Ranch, come in at the same time and explain to us why to this day he's still in violation of state health orders, and why he, well, there's a whole laundry list of things that we've dealt with in the last year with him. And so I would ask that he comes in and that we have a discussion with him also, particularly when it comes to the liquor license, and being the fact that we do have a clear violation is involving a juvenile selling alcohol. So with that being said, if I can get a thumbs up if you guys are all right, or a thumbs down if you're all right with asking Travis Taylor and then also Pizza Ranch's manager. Okay, if we could get them to come in, that would be great. All right, do we have anything else on that, Mr. Manager? All right, we will move on back to the police building. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. You actually have a number of items tonight that do have fairly significant budget implications and provide the benefit of being able to more appropriately plan for the design of our budget coming up here in the spring and into the summer. This item would certainly be one of those, wherein if council does decide that we need to move forward full steam ahead in terms of pursuing this project, that would be good information to have as we put together our budget and try to get ready for that, those implications. Many of you have not sat through much of this discussion in recent years. We did submit the full presentation that we gave to previous councils on this project for your packets. We aren't going to go through that full presentation this evening, but rather a couple key slides so that some very basic facts about this project can be established, and any questions that you might have, direction that you might have, or whatever can be provided to us this evening. If we need to do more research and so on, we can do that too. Whatever you'd like to see, this is meant to prime that discussion and potentially give us some direction that we could use to put our budget together, and more importantly, potentially put this project together. And so with that, I've asked the chief to put together a brief presentation for your information tonight, and we'll see where council wants to go. Thank you.
Chief?
Thank you, Mayor, Council. I appreciate the opportunity to address these possibilities today. Just very briefly, you can see by the slideshow here that the Casper Police Department has never had a purpose-built facility of their own. Beginning in the 1930s, we occupied borrowed space. In 1977, we moved into the Hall of Justice, and although the first three floors of that was intended for public safety purposes, the building itself is not kept up with the pace of technology changes. In 1990s, we fully outgrown our building, and we began to transfer our people into other locations that just made themselves available. From a personnel management point of view, that introduces inefficiencies and organizational silos. It's never a good idea to separate your people out and get them away. In 2010, we entered, because we are completely out of space, we entered into an agreement to move our dispatching out to a third party also. And then, in 2010 we went to the city center building. We've transferred our internal affairs, our career services, our recruiting and selection to that building. And in 2014 we moved out the dispatchers. You'd think I'd follow my own slide better than that. You know, what we're trying to accomplish is the reality of the space that we have is just not functional anymore. We've introduced so much organizational inefficiency that it's not helping us in our public safety goals. You've got a couple examples there that I don't want to take the time to go through all of those, but suffice it to say that we are housing people in janitorial closets. Offices that were meant for one person, we've jammed 3 in there. And so I walk by periodically checking on my people, and I hear 3 of them on the phone to suspects, to witnesses, and they're trying to carry on conversations all at the same time, and it's highly inefficient. Our evidence holdings are a problem that we have continued to address, and we've made amazing progress at improving our evidence holdings in the facilities in which we hold them, but it's still not up to standards. There's too much detail in this slide for me to point out too much, but what we have right now today, not including the rented space for the PSCC or dispatch, we have about 35,000 square feet. When we put out the RFP for a needs assessment, the specialist, a nationally recognized, renowned expert, was the one that came to our community and really took a hard look at what we should have according to today's needs. And just for today's needs, not including dispatch, we needed 65,000 feet. When you include dispatch in these numbers, it's roughly 40,000 feet and 70,000 feet just to meet today's operational needs. And that expert projected our needs by the year 2040 to increase, in this case, not including dispatch, to 75,000 feet, 80,000 feet, including that dispatch stub. What's important for you to notice that I want to point out is of that 34,000 feet that you have depicted here, there are vast areas that don't really apply to us. So if you can follow the pointer, it's not showing up. The one on the upper right, the big purple area, that's on the second floor of the Hall of Justice, and that's the weight room that we share with the Sheriff's Department. On the slide, the image immediately next to that is the first floor of the Hall of Justice. And all of that purple area is really not space that we can use. It's the shared space of building utilities, shared lobby, elevators, and things of that nature. The slide immediately adjacent to that is over in the Marathon building, which is, you know, those are dark and dank little rooms that we just store stuff in. There's no way to use that for personnel in the maze of that building. Down in the bottom floor of the Marathon building, we have consolidated and done a really good job of managing our evidence overflow in there. But again, that's not really usable space. So much of that 34,000 feet really isn't usable for us today. So we, you know, in the needs assessment really did point out, you know, we looked at available structures, existing structures, available opportunities throughout our city, and when it boiled down to it, they put a pencil to paper and determined that it was going to be more expensive to try to remodel and use our ongoing rental space at the Hall of Justice than it was to build a new building. We are not taking this lightly as a police department. This was a really good hard look at what the department needs today and what they would need in the next 20 years. And where there was not extravagances put into that, unfortunately the cost is expensive. It's $42 million. And we're aware that that's a significant impact on our citizens and on our community. What that included in that an amount was for police operations, also the courts, the fleet needs that we have, and the training facilities that we need to have to remain an effective police department. So with that, the city manager has tasked me to come up with some available options in our city of city-owned property on which is available for council to consider. When we pulled up the maps and looked at, you know, what lots are available, there's 3 to 4 that have the acreage, and I would say that most of them all have identifiable issues that are associated with them. So in full disclosure, let's take a look at these options. One of which, as everybody's aware, we own, the city of Casper owns a great deal of property up by the event center. This particular location, the pluses are, it has good ingress and egress. It's right there at the intersection of Events Drive and Poplar. And the plus about it is it's got enough acreage up there to really design something to use that space effectively, and actually, you know, as the city continued to expand, it would have acreage enough to do that. The downsides are that we're on the far extremes of the city's edge, and you know, although although we're not a fire department, we wait in the building and wait for the calls to come. The officers still have to come several times a day to meet with their supervisors, to turn in evidence, to process things, to have their briefings and their debriefings. And so having something out on the outskirts of the city does create, over time, a loss of efficiency is just in the driving time available to it. This is one area that the city owns and could put to good use. That one does have great access right there by the interstate, right there by Poplar Drive. It does have great access to it, but when we discuss opportunities like that, we also remember that our citizens we want a facility where our citizens can come and get customer service from us, be convenient to them. Part of our facility was meeting space for our community, to hold community meetings there with the police department to partner with us. The next location, council's very aware of this, is the area adjacent to our cemetery. That's one of the ones that we've looked at. It's an 8-acre parcel. The plus sides of it, centrally located on our city. The downsides, it's got a sloping terrain, and it would remove our ability to expand our cemetery. This one is a new one to me that I had not had the opportunity to discuss, but it's right here adjacent to YESNESS Park, and directly accessible off of Wyoming Boulevard, again on the outer edges of our community. But that is available space. The pros of this one is that it has great access onto Wyoming Boulevard, and the cons would be just like the 12th and Conwell. This is a sloping property, and it would require grading. And actually, this is the diagram that you see there today is an 8-acre parcel. However, as you continue north, that property beyond that is ours also and available, so we could actually make this into enough space. Now, this is so I've given you some examples. There's one more that we were looking at, but we're still even scouring what other holdings that the city has so that we can present that to council. But the reality is that the police department knows that this is an expensive undertaking. We would tell you that the time has come for us to really get serious about it. Your public safety goals are kind of being held back by our inefficiencies due to our structure and the separation of our people. And we have almost no capacity for our citizens to partner with us, to come to our police department and help engage with us in achieving our public safety goals. So we're very cognizant of it, but we're also aware that trying to save money out of the existing 1 cent money over time was going to take a long time. We also know that it's one of the things that we've pondered and discussed is an optional 6th cent. We could also put out bonding and go into debt for this, and we're also aware that there are some programs such as Build Wyoming that is available to us, but we're not blithely going about business realizing that this is a significant expense to our tax-paying citizens. But we do believe that it is, as we continue to address the changing needs of law enforcement, and quite frankly, out of my 30 years, the last 5 years has seen significant change. We're very hard to keep pace with all of that. When it boils down to it, is we have been making do for approximately 20 years. We've been scratching by. We have been using available properties, spreading our people out throughout the community. Some of them are quite distant from us. And we are using parts of essentially borrowed buildings, such as the Marathon building, just to survive. But we're really losing our opportunity to maintain our professionalism, to achieve our accreditation standards that we are working very hard to do. We're anticipating this calendar year, way ahead of schedule, of achieving our accreditation goals, but some of that is in jeopardy because of the challenges that we face. And so with that, Mayor, I would turn it over to any questions.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. So nobody's been pushing this probably more than I have. I understand the need, and we're going to get a lot of backlash from our citizens, which I also understand. But if we don't take care of our police, there's going to be a lot more problems than people can imagine. Now, there are also other options that I've looked into concerning this program. There are other places available. There are other ways to get to funding. There's other ways to facilitate this. I've looked at our leases that we have. We're paying $250,000 a year to rent space to have our police everywhere. Now, right now, and I remember Councilmember Powell saying when on his finale that this is the time you do these things. The interest rates are as low as they can be. We can garner enough money through Build Wyoming and at those interest rates and pay less money than we're paying right now in rent. So it's an absolute no-brainer. We have an ability and a chance to take care of this problem and cost our taxpayers no more money than we're currently paying. And there are other options, and my suggestion to the council, and I'm not sure how to go about this, but I would love to see a committee put together to explore some of these other options. I'd love to be part of that committee, and I'd like to see this thing move forward at a more rapid than less pace so that we can get on board, take advantage of interest rates and everything else. And I don't think we have to spend $40 million to get done what we want to get done. I think it can be done better than that, and there are other options, but I think we need a committee put together that we can bounce and then bring something to the council that's real. Because I have a hard time believing our constituents and this council would not entertain doing something so gratifying for our city and our police department and pay less money on a yearly basis than we're paying now to rent and be inefficient.
When was the $40,000 determined that it was needed? Was that back in like 2017, 18?
Mayor, I'm sorry, the $40,000 or
I'm
the
sorry,
40,000
yeah, when
square?
did they determine that the $40 million price tag, when did they decide that it was needed? Was that a couple of years ago?
Mayor, Councilwoman, that is a great question. That needs assessment was completed in September of 2019. So not yet still, but we do know that every year that goes by, pretty much you're adding 5% at least.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. I do agree with some of the points Councilman Nell made. I'd be, something with a price tag this big, I'd love to see a committee really flesh it out and give it more attention than we're able to give in these short meetings every Tuesday. So I think I would support that because the chief, I think, has done the courtesy of, I imagine all of us has probably walked through the police department, and it is very, I feel bad for our police force. I do. I don't want to speak too strongly, but I'm very glad my workspace doesn't look like that. They have people jammed into crazy small spots with no windows, no natural light. I mean, it's like cinder blocks and a door. It's a really sad state in there. A couple questions I have for the chief, though. One, wasn't there a location at Eastridge Mall that was in the running or part of the assessment? I was curious if there was any reason that wasn't in the presentation.
Chief?
Mayor, Councilman, you know, we absolutely did due diligence. Part of that RFP for the needs assessment was we wanted to be able to answer our citizens of, hey, did you think of this? Did you think of that? Did you look at this opportunity? And we did. We looked at all the vacant properties in town. We looked at existing facilities that the occupant may be inclined to vacate. The particular, there were an abundance of problems with the Eastridge Mall location. One of which is we never really could get locked down on what the price would be for us to do that. But it was the HVAC was going to be a huge problem with that one to maintain the square footage of the existing location there. Having a shared wall that was insecure, there was a lot of things that were going into it. It was one of the less expensive options. But it also was one of the ones that had the least opportunity for meeting the goals of having a usable facility for the next 50 plus years. That one had a much shorter lifespan to it.
Thank you. I had one follow-up for you, and then if I could ask the city attorney a question after that, and then that's it. Again, I haven't unfortunately had the time to really read, word for word the assessment, and really absorb it, and create a super informed opinion. So that's why I would love, I love the idea of a committee. I know there's been an assessment done for the need for the police department. I wonder, has there been any sort of analysis done for, should you guys vacate the Hall of Justice? Is there potential upside for the agencies that are in that building? You know, is there an upside for the, sheriff's office and the folks you share the building with, out of curiosity? Thank
Yes,
you.
with the Mayor, Councilman, there's been an abundance of communication and correspondence with our shared tenants. You know, to put it mildly, the Natrona County, the sheriff's office would welcome it if we would move out today. They would move into that space. They, like us, have outgrown their space. They're desperate. They've got their people spread out. They're suffering from the same things that we are, and they are looking forward with glee to the ability to forego that rent revenue and occupy that space. So that space would not be vacant. They would occupy it within the week.
Thank you. I think that speaks to, because I'd love to see more coordination between, you know, city, county, because we live in the city of Casper, but also Natrona County. And so if there's a benefit to Natrona County as a whole, their sheriff's department, they're able to utilize that space. That's great. You know, I know we're focused on the city here in these meetings, but it's also great to, you know, make things work elsewhere. So the question I had, I think for John, was the 6th cent. Is that something City Council has the ability? What are the options for implementing something like that? It can be on the ballot under what, you know, I'd love more information about what options there are for 6th cent.
Sure. Just briefly, it's one of the requirements that it's a county-wide tax currently. I know they've looked at modifying that. So basically, you get all of the communities within the county, so Evansville, Mills, Casper, and we need to get pretty much everybody on board, Edgerton, Midwest. And so a lot of times you'll have it where you'll have multiple questions on the ballot. So you'll have propositions there from each of the communities trying to see if they can get that 6th cent, basically a special purpose excise tax is how it's abbreviated, so a spec tax approved by the voters. But to even get there, you have to have, in our case, the county's involved, the city's involved, and you need to get a majority of those separate entities to even get it on the ballot. So there is a little bit of negotiation there. I know that the counties looked in the past at the library. I think that Mills and Evansville have projects in mind for themselves. And I know that Midwest and Edgerton often have difficulty with problems because of their small population and sales tax base. So that may not be a difficulty, but it means that when you get time then for the election, that's kind of spread out a little bit more, and it makes it look like a lot bigger potential cost, even though the voters would have the option to pick and choose of those options. So if they wanted the police department here and none of the other projects, that would be a possibility. And of course, since we have the largest voting block, that would be advantageous to us. But on the other hand, some of the smaller communities may not want to vote for a project that's just going to be here in Casper, even though our police department does a lot for some of the neighboring communities, as their police departments do for us. So there are some underlying issues there. I think there's practical issues, but there are also some legal issues that do have to be overcome and evaluated as the process continues.
Mr. Mayor, I'll come right back to you. Councilman.
I think one of the concerns with the voters is that when you enact a 6th cent, then people think that it will never go away. So I think that maybe if we had the opportunity to look for some potential grants, Build Wyoming, look at all other options before we increase that sales tax. Because I think that the public has a mistrust of government, of once you raise taxes, that tax never goes away.
Councilman Cathy?
Did I misunderstand what I thought happened at the last legislature? Because didn't they pass a bill that said that if the county so chose not to go along with it, that if we received a letter from them stipulating that they weren't going to, that we could actually, within the city limits, propose a 6th cent?
I would defer to the city manager in that regard, if I may.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Kathy, that's correct.
Okay. So, yeah, I thought we could go it alone if we got approval from the county that they had no objection to it. But there are other funding options, and I guess I would like to say that I would like to go along with Councilman Nell's proposal, similar to what was done with the massage ordinance, is to set up a committee, figure out some plans, work with the chief, and look at all of the other funding options through some of the grants that we could get. And there's a good possibility that depending on interest rates and forgivenesses, that over the 20 years, we can pay for it without ever having to raise any more taxes and use a portion of the 1 cent money plus the $250,000 a year that we would be saving in rent. So I see it as a very viable option, and I'm definitely in favor of it. I think one of the biggest things is finding the right place for it and keeping that under wraps, so to speak, so that developers don't try to raise prices of land.
Councilwoman Lutz, and I'll come back to you.
My understanding was that this is like a special purpose tax, and so like once we fully raise the amount for the police building, this tax completely at that point ceases. The fact that people might have this personal perception that it will continue, that's called an opinion, and it's not a fact, so it doesn't really matter that that's what they believe, because it's not true. So it goes away when we raise basically what funds we tell them on day one that we have to raise. When we raise it, that tax goes away.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thank you. I want to offer just a couple thoughts in terms of how we might frame this process. I do agree. I think digging into this a little more in a little more meaty way is appropriate given the price tag. And the things that I'm thinking of as I think about that are, one, I have a hard time looking at this just in a vacuum, because there are a number of other large projects that need attention as well. And so I think it would be helpful if we frame this conversation with a bigger picture in mind. What are the maybe top 5 big ticket items that are coming down the pike, and how can we sort of make a strategy for addressing them collectively? And then the second, I think that when any of those projects really, but speaking about this one specifically, you mentioned our public safety goals. I think that was what was going through my mind when I was touring the police department is, what is the impact of this situation on citizens, particularly since it will be citizens who are paying for this. And so for me, I would really like to see this conversation framed as, what are our safety goals? How is this facility or lack of a facility impacting our citizens? And what advantages will they realize should we be able to bring this project to fruition? So for me, I think framing is going to be important, and process for this. This could be very well one of the biggest things that we undertake as a council if we do decide to proceed. So I think it's important how we proceed, and those are a couple framing things that to me seem really important.
Councilman Gamros.
I'd just like to say that I also concur with Councilwoman Pollock. We discussed several meetings ago the 4 or 5 big ticket items, the sewer, the stormwater, and so if we're in a position where we're having to choose one over the other, I do think it's important not to look at this in a vacuum, and would like a more broad, obviously to get into the details of it, a committee to focus on just the police department, but also a larger conversation so that we can kind of stack these big projects against each other and make an estimation what is going to have the greatest increase, quality of life for the citizens here. Thank you.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with you. I think you are correct. However, I just want to reiterate, when you're sitting at home with your checkbook and you've got your idea of where that money goes every month, and you've got your house payment, and you've got your electric bill, and you've got your gas, and you've got your car payment, you got to balance all that stuff out to pay your own personal bills. I look at this project just like that. We have X amount of dollars that we spend on infrastructure for our police, and if we can do this project without taking it to the citizens, without bearing a 6-cent tax, and find a way to finance this thing, which there are ways, by the way, to finance this for less money than we're paying in rent, then I prefer to keep it in the vacuum where I think it belongs, because we're not taking any extra money and putting it on our taxpayers. In fact, we're probably going to save money overall on a monthly basis when we're talking about the money we're spending in rent. And it reminds me of when I was 18 years old and paying rent, and that money could have been going to a house I'd have paid my house off 20 years ago. So, you know, I'm just trying to dumb it down a little bit, I guess, for this particular thing. We are going to have a lot of big capital projects, and I understand that. But right now, we're talking about this particular one, and that's why I urge us to put a committee together, because there is a way to do this and keep it within the amount of money we're already spending, and yet it would be a capital improvement for our citizens and for this city. And so I just want to keep that perspective on this a little bit if I could, because there's ways to do it, and there's other buildings, but I think those are executive session times where we bring those things up, and we have a couple leases out there, but I believe we've got outs in both of them. And so those are a discussion for another time. But anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.
That's the only thing I wanted to add in, is that we do have some leases out there, and so there is a possibility that we can't just quit paying rent. We still may be on the hook for some of those. So that needs to be part of that discussion. So, Mr. City Manager, what would we do in order to move forward with the committee? Obviously, you got a lot of people that want to be on it, but we only have a certain amount of council members that we could put on there, and obviously, we'd want some experts to be sitting on that committee. So I don't see, I guess I turn that question back over to you on how to go about putting a committee together.
No problem, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to get behind this project and think about it more thoroughly, and maybe even lay plans together to make something like this happen. Because I would agree that it is a very needed part of our infrastructure, and our department is certainly deserving of better than what they have right now. Without a doubt, if council would like to see a committee put together, Mr. Mayor, it probably would be on your shoulders to appoint those from the council. You're 100% correct. We can only probably take 3 in order to stay well within the quorum constraints that we have to deal with. I would recommend that the chief be a part of that. I certainly would like to be a part of that, and I think Mr. Henley will need to be engaged in those discussions, particularly as it relates to the lease issues that we need to certainly consider and work through. Without a doubt, if this group is comfortable with us really dissecting funding alternatives and doing a significant amount of homework in that regard, I'd be pleased to be able to get turned loose on that discussion and have some authority to be able to have meetings and have discussions and so on that gets me to the heart of a proposal that I could bring forward in conjunction with this committee to this group, and see if we can't get some real progress made on plans in that regard. So I think it starts with making some of those appointments, and if council's not ready to do that tonight, we can certainly make that happen with some thought between now and the next time we meet to have those assignments put together.
Okay. Councilman Mill.
I would like to say, if you choose to wait to make those appointments, I want my name in the hat desperately. I will not be here next week at the meeting, so if you choose to postpone that and doing that, I want to make sure that my name's in the running for that, if you don't mind.
So I would ask that whoever is interested in being part of that committee, if you would just shoot me an email, and or actually shoot Carter an email. That way it's not coming to me. But shoot Carter an email, and then I'll at least know who the members are, and then you and I can get together and make those appointments this week before you leave town. So,
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions of the chief or the manager on this?
Just one.
Comment.
Sorry. The current building that you're housing the dispatch center in would be a viable option, would it not?
Mayor, Councilman, that is one of the things that we researched and looked at, you know, the viability of that location. We felt it was a viable location. It wasn't necessarily ideally centrally situated, but the facility itself we believed was viable, and so we did explore that extensively.
And it is important for our constituents in the community to understand that the money we spend in rent yearly is not a reflection of all the money going out. I know, for instance, in our lease up there where the dispatch center is, we're about to put $100,000 into the HVAC system that we don't even own, that somebody else owns that building. But it's our responsibility as part of that lease. So that is another 6 figures going out the door that wasn't even accounted for when I said the 250. So I guess I just want people to understand there's a lot more than just $250,000 a year we spend to maintain these buildings and pay rent. So thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Do you have anything else on that, Mr. City Manager?
Mr. Mayor, if I could get a thumbs up with regard to the general acceptance of the concepts that I described, then I'll feel like that's authority enough to really get running on this issue, if that's okay.
Was
Councilmember Paul.
doing the research on the funding and also establishing the committee, are those the?
That's basically it, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to annexation of East Robertson Road addition update, Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. The annexation process that the city is required to go through has multiple steps, as you have already witnessed and experienced. One of those significant steps is that of completing and submitting the annexation report that is a statutory obligation on behalf of every annexation that the city conducts. Certainly, without a doubt, where you have an annexation of this size and complexity, the details in this report are really important for the council to understand. Although I would tell you that as annexations go and as the facts associated with said annexations go, this is about as perfect a situation as you can find. And the reality is because, you know, the services are already there, the subject area is surrounded by the city, and the services that these individuals and residents have been enjoying for a long time have been provided on the part of the citizens of Casper to make that happen. And so the confluence of all these facts with regard to this particular annexation are really quite favorable. The only thing that probably is not as favorable is that this is not a huge population center. And so we're not talking about huge sales tax dollars that would be coming into the coffers of the city every year. But nonetheless, as it relates to the equity with regard to the access to services that these citizens already have, it makes all the sense in the world to have happen. As far as those dollars are concerned on an annual basis, I'm going to tell you that we're looking at probably in the neighborhood of $40,000 to $50,000 a year once the annexation is complete. And while that's not a lot of money, you look at the accumulation of these dollars over time, and it adds up, and it does help for even some of the smaller things that the general fund has to fund. And so all of these dollars help, in my opinion, even though we're not talking about a honeypot of sales tax dollars that would be coming into the community. The good news is, with respect to annexations in general, and certainly as it relates to this annexation, this is not a cost impact that the resident inside the subject area will feel. They aren't going to pay more sales taxes as it relates to the sales tax dollars the city gets. It's simply an allocation at the state level that would be forwarded to the city of Casper that is not a cash impact on the citizen in the subject area here. So in other words, it's a mathematic equation that favors the city of Casper, albeit incrementally on a smaller basis than what a lot of these annexations typically include. As I mentioned, the annexation report points out a number of really critical facts that it makes these kinds of decisions very, very clear, not only to the taxpayers and so forth that are concerned about this, but for you as decision makers as well. And as I mentioned, the facts couldn't be more favorable probably because city services are already there. And so the city of Casper is not going to have to take on added costs to provide services to the subject area because they're in place already. Robertson Road, for example, is a long constructed collector street that these taxpayers have been using for a long, long time. And we're not going to have to build a road in order to provide service to the area. City utilities are already in place and are already there for residents to use, many of which have been using on a in-city utility rate basis, which I mentioned the last time we talked about this, albeit not necessarily the way it was supposed to be. These folks have already been paying utility rates for a long time and aren't going to see an increase in order to be a part of the city. As far as property tax dollars go, we were talking about very, very negligible numbers. And I would tell you that were these folks coming into the in-city utility rate paradigm, that would be a complete wash as it relates to the impacts that property tax dollars would otherwise provide. In this situation, it would actually be financially more harmful to them to stay outside of the city because we now have an obligation, if they are going to stay outside of the city, to increase their utility rates to match that of other folks who pay utility rates that are outside the limits of the city, if that makes any sense. And so for these folks, it's actually an advantage to go ahead and complete the annexation. The other element of the annexation report that's really critical for the city council to understand is that indeed all of the statutory requirements that annexations typically require and engender are being met with regard to this process should it pass and come into fruition. So we don't see any areas as it relates to statutory requirement that's being ignored or that we don't pass off on, if you will, with respect to an annexation coming into completion here. With that, with those major areas being sort of accomplished with this annexation and anticipated and studied as a part of this report, my recommendation to you would be to A, accept the report on a formal basis, and B, continue with the annexation and bring these folks into the community that like they probably should have been done a number of years ago. And that's my report.
Okay. Councilman Nell?
Thank you, sir. Were there any negative, I'm sure they sent out a survey to all the folks in the area, right? And I looked through this, but I didn't really see any, are any of them really against this?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, we do not survey the area in question, although we did have a number of neighborhood meetings with the residents in the subject area. Certainly some of the question that they had was with regard to use of their property, that when you live outside of the county, or excuse me, outside of the city in the county, there are things that you can do in the county that you don't typically get to do within the city. For example, you know, if you're living out in the county, you generally can have looser use of your property as it relates to storing vehicles, storing other things on your property, and so on. That would change for these neighbors, although the zoning classification that we're recommending for this is a pretty liberal zoning classification, particularly as it relates to city, you know, in city standards. And so in my opinion, they're really not losing as much as you would see for a typical county property.
And I do understand it because I did my homework and I read it. So I get all that. I'm just wondering, were any of them against it? Like blatantly, we don't want this.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. A lot of the complaint that we got was along the lines that I just described. Now, in terms of people saying, I positively don't want this to happen and I'm going to sue or whatever, we didn't get that level of emotion associated with this, but we certainly did get some complaint, mostly along the lines of what I just described.
Councilwoman Ingebrigtsen.
Two questions.
Sure.
Is this going to be designated as urban residential? Is that how the zoning's going to be?
Mr. Mayor, Madam Councilwoman, the designation will be an agricultural designation. And the, I'm looking real quickly here for what the actual title is.
Urban agriculture.
Agricultural, okay.
Page 49 of the packet, yeah.
Thank you.
And
That's the designation, thank you.
so the current citizens that are living in that annexation part, so they're not going to have a special assessment?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, that's correct. There are no assessments needed because services are already available. Yep.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you for the presentation, City Manager Napier. For anyone that might have questions about it, I thought the inclusion of the frequently asked questions on starting on page 51 of the city packet was really informative, had a lot of good questions that people would probably have, so they could get those answers there, and then just a really good outline starting on page 54 of just what the benefits are and, possible considerations. So thank you for putting that all together. It's very informative for anyone that wants more information on this subject.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, are we good with accepting the report and moving forward with the annexation? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right, and then we'll move on to utility rate model review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of the council, I'm going to ask that we switch from this to a computer-aided demonstration tonight as it relates to utility rates and what our recommendations are this evening. And frankly, our recommendation this evening is to just hold the course as it relates to what was recommended for rate increases back in November of 19 and formally adopted in January of 20. We are in the middle of a 2-year rate cycle, and we committed to your previous council that we would come back a year later, which is where we're at now, and basically give you a status report as to the pro forma performance of the utilities, which include water, sewer, bale fill, and refuse, and let you know where we're at in terms of what you might expect to see coming up in November, which would, essentially be towards the end of our current rate cycle and where we think we might be from a projection standpoint. Now, part of what I'd like to do this evening, as far as giving you that status update, is give our newer council, if you will, more of an orientation with respect to the tools that we use to try to shine a light on the data and what it's telling us, so that that data drives these discussions and at least gives you a feel from a data perspective where we think we are and where we think we need to be moving forward. I would absolutely invite any questions you have, any concerns you want to address. And of course, we're going to try to give you a real, I'm going to say technical perspective, if you will, as it relates to what we think the data is saying and where we need to go. And in order to do that, I'd like to start with the water fund, if we could. The water fund tends to be a fund that is fairly inelastic with regard to the product that's bought by our citizens. We are finding that except in periods of significant drought, we don't see a whole lot of fluctuation with respect to buying patterns and consumption behaviors and so on. For those of you that serve on the Regional Water Board, you know that one of the biggest expenses that we have as a water utility is in the form of buying water from Regional Water. And a lot of times, the rate increases and so forth that Regional Water considers has a fairly significant impact with respect to the enterprise fund that you are the board of directors over, if you will. The enterprise fund that you oversee then therefore deals with the management of that major water purchase, that commodity purchase, as well as maintaining the water infrastructure that delivers and transmits water to our citizens. And so with that, I would direct your attention to our screens here. And I really appreciate IT's work and the clerk's office work in making sure all of our monitors are operable. I'm really pleased that they're back online. Is it? Yeah, that's probably not helpful to you, is it? Yeah. Let me do that here real quick. The mayor has his own one.
All right.
Which is appropriate because he's the mayor.
Well, they had to until a minute.
Yeah.
You are seeing two charts here, and the one on the right-hand side, as indicated by the date on the top of that chart, would indicate that that is what we projected and presented to the council at the start of this rate cycle, which was back in November, December of 19. And you can see, as you compare the two charts to where we're at now in February of 21 to where we, thought we would be and where we thought the fund was going back in November, December of 19, that there isn't a whole lot of difference. And that's good news. Let me tell you a little bit, however, with what these lines mean. The big fat red line at the very bottom there is the line that says you are out of money and this fund is busted. And as you can tell, with respect to the activity of the blue line, we really like to keep that blue line far, far away from the red line, because that blue line is a reflection of what we're projecting coupled with actual data that we've received in years leading up to our projection period. So to me, that is really your behavioral curve that you want to keep a close eye on, particularly as it relates to its distance from that red line, okay? I would also tell you that with regard to that black line, you want to keep the blue line as much above that black line as you think is appropriate, because that black line indicates when it is that you're starting to dip into reserves, okay? So anytime you see that blue line dip below the black line, which you will see later here as we talk about solid waste, that's kind of a warning to you that in fact we are moving into reserves, and we're using reserves sometimes in a very appropriate fashion to deal with major capital expenses that we know is temporary, and those kinds of things. Now that green line is really an interesting trend line that I want to point out to you as well. We like having that green line in place because it gives you a feel for what your buffer looks like as it relates to staying above your reserves. So when you see that blue line trending around the green line, in my opinion, that is kind of your ideal operating position. When you're at least within the area of the green line, you know that you're operating in a pretty comfortable buffer area as it relates to the relationship with reserves, and certainly as it relates to relationships with that red line, which is an awful line to be near, okay? So the green line really is only meant to reflect, again, what I consider more of an ideal operating condition. Obviously, the more you're above that green line, you're determining whether or not that spatial relationship's appropriate, and whether or not the fund is too healthy or not healthy enough. As it relates to the water fund specifically, let me bring you back to some of the analysis that we think we understand. First of all, I've already told you, I think we're operating a little more favorably with regard to where we thought we would be from almost, a year ago at this point in time. And that's indicated as it relates to the distance between the blue line, particularly where that crook occurs, and that text box kind of gives you a feel for what our fund balance is. at this moment in time. We are seeing that, perform a little higher above the rest of the lines than what we thought a year ago would look like. That's good news. Another thing, though, that I want to tell you is we're seeing a little predictive ability, too, as it relates to the fund's activity moving into the out years. If you'll notice on the chart from back in December of 19, we thought that a lot of the expenses and so forth in comparison to rates and whatnot for the water fund were going to bring us closer to that green line and potentially push us closer into the area of the buffer zone. As you look at 2021, however, given the improved revenue situation that we're seeing, that actually is having an impact on what we're looking at for out years, because we haven't built additional projects into the prospectus to try to take advantage of that additional revenue. And so consequently, you're seeing a little bit of a savings account being developed in those out years, albeit not by much, of course, in that the blue line is hovering a little bit above that buffer green line, that indicating line. And that is, that's positive news, albeit again, marginally, not by much. If you look down into the spreadsheet area that is driving a lot of the activity of these lines here, the trend lines and so on, you're seeing a summarized, sort of boiled down version of the back office spreadsheets that we have going on to try to reflect a lot of the complexities that these funds operate around. So you're seeing what it is in sort of summary form we're recommending in out years with regard to rate increases that at this point in time we're trying to project for your information. We're also trying to demonstrate to you the infusion of 1 cent dollars into these funds and the way in which it helps offset a lot of those expenses that would otherwise be borne solely by the rate model itself. And so you are seeing a little bit of help come in from 1 cent activity that brings some relief to what the rate model would otherwise have to endure. You're also seeing some activity, some demonstration of what these rates will indicate for a typical residential consumer toward the far end of the spreadsheet there. And as I look at this little tiny screen, I can't even tell you what those numbers say, but you can at least see, be given some kind of indication as to what those increments are going to look like for a typical residential customer, which means some residential customers are going to have higher bills and some residential customers are going to have lower bills because they might have bigger or larger properties to irrigate or, whatever the case may be. We don't have a real good feel for what commercial properties and what commercial customers look like here in this demonstration, but certainly as we get into rate increases, that we might propose or whatever, we would have that information available to you so you can see your array of customers and how they're all impacted. The other thing that we try to measure and account for is obviously capital. Capital expenses are going to impact dramatically funds of this nature because generally speaking for utility funds and utility businesses, those projects are expensive. And without a doubt, as we get into the sewer fund, you're going to see what that looks like as we try to demonstrate through data our impacts of trying to repair our wastewater plant looks like. And in that circumstance, we are an 85% shareholder, if you will, by virtue of the consumption that we place upon that plant through our citizens. We also try to account for a general cost of living type increase that we can anticipate, an inflationary increase each year. And, you know, sometimes we can debate as to whether or not 3% is appropriate or 1% is appropriate. Those are some of the factors that you get to mess with as you think about these things and anticipate what these costs might look like. And we try to, you know, envision the right data that would give us the appropriate justification for looking at all those factors as we bring these kinds of things forward. You'll see here in some of the other funds, major things that we're trying to save money for will also impact a lot of what these funds will need and how they react. The water fund is not as significant in that regard at this moment in time. One thing that I want to tell you, though, that you really should keep in mind, the water fund is built around the premise, in large part, as I mentioned earlier, in dealing with water purchases that we take on as a consumer of regional waters, but also in dealing with water line replacements and repairs and extensions and so forth. You should know that the agenda that we have as it relates to consuming a lot of those 1-cent dollars and other projects that are borne by the water rate itself is really done on a 200-year basis. And so as the board of directors for this particular business enterprise, you need to determine, is 200 years really the right performance factor that we want to see in terms of replacing our water network? To me, that's a pretty conservative approach, but the reality is the minute you, adjust that upwards to say 100 years, or you adjust it the other way like we used to have it, where it was like 400 years, it does make an impact almost immediately in terms of the amount of capital that you would need to invest or not invest in as much. And so you get to determine how aggressive we are or not with respect to how this network is rebuilt and replaced in small parts every year. That's a lot of conversation as it relates to how this data is assembled and what these charts really mean. But as it relates to the water fund specifically, I'm going to recommend that we, again, hold the course as you see in our rate proposal that both was approved by your previous council and as to what we're kind of projecting over the next few fiscal years. The water fund's doing well, and we're going to learn a lot more as we get into our last irrigation season that we'll be able to reflect in its actual data coming up in November and December of this year, where we will say, hey, we think we may need an increase, or we may say, yeah, we don't think you need as big of an increase, and we can absorb some of the health that this fund has generated over the last 12 months. Any questions about the water fund before we move on to the sewer fund?
Good.
Very good. All right. Well, let's move on to the sewer fund. As we move from here, the issues get a little more complex because, believe it or not, we do have a lot of major capital things we need to consider and understand as a means of considering decisions for these funds. I'm not sure what all you know or remember about previous conversations along these lines, but the sewer fund is actually one of those funds that keys off what you do on the water fund pretty closely. We set the sewer fund rates based on what it is that we pay for in terms of water during the lowest consumption periods of the year in order to set our sewer rates. So for example, you're using a lot of water in January and February to deal with sewage issues, right? You're flushing toilets, you're showering, you're turning on your sink and those kinds of things, but you're not irrigating. And so in our opinion, setting sewer rates based on that type of consumption in that portion of our consumption cycle seems to make sense because you are pushing sewage and sewer water nearly exclusively in those periods of time. You're not out washing cars, you're not out watering grass and flowers. You're really only dealing with sending sewer water, wastewater into the sewer system. And so we propose that that be the period of time where you look at, you know, consumption type patterns in order to establish sewer rate issues. The only other problem, though, that we have here is we still have to deal with sewer lines. We still have to deal with replacements and extensions as warranted. But you also have the sewer plant that we are billed for, again, on an 85% basis, that helps us understand our basket, our full basket of costs that we need to try to build a business plan around. In the sewer situation, we suggest that a sewer line replacement strategy of considering the whole network being replaced every 300 years as being a relatively appropriate metric to observe. And I know that sounds like, holy cow, 300 years. But as I mentioned about the water fund, the minute you start adjusting up or down as to whether or not that metric changes, you do see expenses in your capital side respond rather quickly. And accordingly, your blue lines start to fluctuate very quickly around that green line and dipping even into the black line area. As you can see here, the sewer fund is also responding fairly favorably to the activity that we've seen over the last year. In December, we did not think we would have as much margin as you're seeing right now, moving out of the middle part of the chart towards the out years. There's quite a favorable gap there above the green line. And so you're operating above ideal operating condition fairly well moving into the next fiscal year. And that's good news. We like to see that happen. And as you look at this image, kind of keep it in mind with regard to what you're about to see in sanitation, because there's quite a bit of a fluctuation that you need to be aware of as we move into sanitation. The other thing that I would have you pay attention to with respect to the sewer fund and be aware of is that tail end of that blue line. If you recall from what I said in our discussion of the water fund, the difference that blue line makes above that green line is an indication, if you will, of your savings account that you're developing. And for the sewer fund, I think that's pretty critical, that you consider how much disparity you see between that blue line and that green line, because you've got a huge cost coming up here in future years as it relates to our proportion of the expense to rehabilitate the sewer plant. And so I would tell you right now, if you look at the 2021 chart, and you're looking at, the 3 or 4 years that we develop a margin between that green and blue line, you're not seeing a whole lot of savings account being developed in relation to the money that will be needed for the repair of the sewer plant. And so my request to you would be to consider that a little more, because the further and further we get into the out years with our performance actuals will indicate, you're getting closer and closer to the drop dead time frame, if you will, of making that major repair. Now, the good news is we don't think that the rate model will have to endure and bear the entire portion of our cost for that plant, because we are going to seek grants and we are going to seek other funding opportunities to help bear the cost of the repair of that plant. But indeed, to say that the rate model here will not have any skin in the game would be foolish on my part to try to represent to you, even at this stage in the build-up period until that reconstruction needs to happen. Okay, any questions about the sewer fund, please?
Councilman Nell.
So if I understand what you're saying, at the rate our savings account is growing, it's not going to be nearly where it's going to need to be in 4 years, 10 years, 20?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, our outlook as it relates to that plant's rehabilitation is probably 7 years at the best. So my suggestion to you at this point, particularly as we get into the rate setting season of November, December of this year, is to keep in mind what it is that we should consider as a savings goal that we start with right now in order to come up with our portion of that, that plant's rehabilitation. Right now, I'm telling you that we're probably not there because, you know, we're talking about $25 to $30 million that might be needed for that plant. And our portion of that will be 85% of that, right? So I am going to present to you what that savings goal ought to look like when we get towards the end of our rate setting cycle so that you have some ideas as to what it is that we might need to be considering.
Councilman Cathy.
All I was going to do was bring up the 25 to 30 million so that the new council members understood the amount that blue line has to be up there if we don't get the grants or anything else. So Carter already answered what I wanted to bring up. Thank you, Carter.
Thank you.
Because everybody needed to realize the money we're looking at.
Pretty big number.
Yeah.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. City Manager Napier, could you please go back to the, forgive me, I'm not quite understanding this, but it seemed to be, you mentioned that the water fund was operating under a premise that we'd need to replace the infrastructure every 200 years, and the sewer fund is operating under the premise that we'd have to, you know, completely redo it every 300 years. So does that mean that we are setting the rates under that premise, which to me seems, you know, 300 years, our country hasn't even been around 300 years. So that seems a little conservative, as you put it. I appreciate the PC language, but I would use the word absurd. So our rates are set now with the expectation, I guess I don't know how to vocalize what I'm saying, but essentially, if we, you mentioned cutting that in half, so every 100 years or something like that, that would have a, you know, that would increase utility rates essentially, right? Because you're saying you're doing those capital projects twice as often. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Gamroth, that's right. And believe you me, that really is meant to be just a frame of reference, not a real scientific, you know, metric that we say, okay, now what if we did 380 years? How would that look, you know? But yes, that's correct. If we wanted to improve the rate at which we replace sewer lines and you know, do new lines and so on, you would see these calculations and demonstrations react very, very quickly and aggressively. And so it's a delicate balance between paying for our portion of the plant, between taking in revenue from our consumers who pay sewer bills, and dealing with sewer lines and dealing with the maintenance of those lines, which includes backups and manholes and frankly that 9-mile sewer line project that we're engaged in right now. There's a lot that figures into this, and we certainly do appreciate the 1-cent dollars that you invest into here, as you can see on the column here, because that helps relieve what would otherwise be needed by the rate model, or we remove those related expenses from a capital standpoint.
Any other questions? Councilman Cathy.
I just wanted to make one comment, is that we figure that basically, due to tourism, other things, that roughly, half of our sales tax money at times comes from outside the residents of Casper? Or is it more than that?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Cathy, I want to say it's more along the lines of 30 to 40% than it is 50 or higher.
Okay, so basically by what we're doing by using 1-cent money is we are actually allowing our tourists to help pay for our sewer system rather than dumping all of that rate onto our residents. So that's another thing that's helping out particularly the middle and lower income people within the community.
It's a very good way of putting it, absolutely.
And anytime we're using it on any of these enterprise fund services, sewer, trash, water, that's allowing everybody else to help pay for those services that our citizens are getting.
Correct.
And that's probably more on point with your comment earlier about once you raise rates, you don't generally see your water and sewer rates go down, if ever. So that would be more of a real concern for our constituents, if you will.
Well, and Mr. Mayor, if I could build on that comment a little bit, it would have to assume too that our expenses were going down as well. And you're right, PVC does not go down. You know, steel has not gone down in quite some time. Absolutely correct. Labor, positively. Chemicals, all that goes up. You bet.
Councilmember Pollock.
Sort of along that line, I'm trying to understand these graphs the best I can, but it seems like generally our fund balances are trending downward for the most part. Is that because we are raising rates at a less quickly than costs are going up, or is it because we are making capital investments into the infrastructure, or both, or why is that looking like that?
That's a very good question. I appreciate that question, Mr. Mayor, Council Member Pollock. It's a combination of things, absolutely. If indeed you wanted that blue line to be, you know, flat and hover above the green line in a more consistent margin, you would need to raise those rates more aggressively than what you're seeing on the chart. Basically, what you're seeing in terms of a demonstration of philosophy here is you're seeing those balances that are above the ideal operating condition being used to absorb some of those costs more, I'm going to say appropriately, because these are driven by council policy, instead of trying to make sure that the rates make everything flat and not allow for that absorption of some of these investments to happen. And so in some cases, we see revenue come through better than we projected, and that helps to soften the, you know, the profound nature of those dips. But in most cases, what we're saying is when you have that kind of margin over the ideal operating condition, then letting that absorb a lot of those expenses is probably appropriate.
Thanks.
And then thereby keeping the rates more moderated. Any other questions about sewer? Okay, now, sanitation is going to provide a bit of a weird experience after seeing water and sewer. And in fact, I can hardly look at it without, you know, feeling some anxiety. If you look at the refuse collection fund of 19, we really did not anticipate what you would see, clearly, what you would see at what actually happened in 2021, okay? Or I should say in 2020, because that's really what it reflects. Just a little bit of 2021, obviously. We saw the blue line operating fairly comfortably within the black and green line margin, that buffer margin. We knew that they were, you know, going to be sort of hovering in between there because of the purchase of trucks and so forth that was invariably going to happen. What we did not expect was exactly how COVID would deal with refuse and the behaviors that we had no way of envisioning in November of 19 and starting into the early part of 2020. Let me tell you a little bit about this fund here, and I have to get my folks to explain it to me almost every year, which I feel like a dork for even asking, but the refuse fund is actually the business entity that manages and envisions the neighborhood activity, if you will, both on the corporate and residential side of our going out and picking up trash. So that includes the rollouts that you push out to the curb. It includes the dumpsters that are in our alleys. It includes the nasty garbage that restaurants put into the heavy dumpsters there. It includes, you know, corporate neighbors needing 3 pickups a week versus our needing only 1 pickup a week as residents here in Casper. This is really a measure of activity that we take on to pick up trash from all of our neighbors in Casper. Okay? The reason that that's important is because we need to understand what our costs are in order to assume this activity so that we can bill appropriately, right? Because you'll notice in the spreadsheets here, we do not get infusions from 1%. We don't get subsidies from the general fund. This is all enterprise-based. And so every element of activity that takes place here deals with our costs to go pick up the trash. Now, obviously, that includes the cost of replacing trucks. That includes the cost of repairing and replacing dumpsters. That is every bit of those costs. We even apply our street sweepers into this fund because they're out picking up trash too. It's just the trash that's the rubbish on the streets. And those machines, while they are one of my favorite machines that we own, are very expensive. And in fact, I heard Cindy say the other day they're almost as expensive as our sanitation trucks because there's just so many moving parts and things that break and brushes that need to be replaced and so on. Now, the thing that we didn't understand that would happen is what would take place as it relates to consumption behavior moving into COVID and 2020. What we saw was most of our commercial accounts said, hey, I'm not going to need 3 pickups a week because I'm barely filling up our dumpster once a week because of the decline in business activity. You know, we had a lot of businesses that just weren't performing like they normally were in regular seasons. And so the problem is that when we don't have that revenue coming in, our sunk costs are not being compensated like they used to be. And so that revenue dip was significant for us. When you place that against the layer of residential garbage going much more aggressively, most of that is uncompensated. Because even though we are dumping once a week at your house and my house and so on, those cans are a lot fuller. And those extra pickups are a lot more aggressive. But we don't get to charge more because that's what our rate is built on is, an average collection cycle, not a very, very aggressive residential collection cycle. Furthermore, a lot of people were bringing in their utility bills and coming into the scales. And we saw that happen very aggressively as well. Again, not a compensated service that we offer because we build those models on average years of activity, not on aggressive years of activity with me bringing in 10 residential bills in a 3-month period versus once a summer, right? So accordingly, that blue line looks terrible compared to what it is that we thought we were going to have to do and deal with and accommodate. Because you got those mixing forces of commercial activity going through the floor and uncompensated residential activity going through the roof. Now, we believe that that's a temporary phenomenon. And we would suggest that the activity that you're seeing here, albeit that blue line is trending toward that red line in an uncomfortable way, is not going to be our history from now on. And I'm really hoping that by the time we come talk to you in November and December, we're going to see those blue lines kind of tipping up towards the black line. And so accordingly, I am not suggesting that we do any rate manipulating right now because I want to see how this summer does for us because we might make that up in commercial activity. That might be too optimistic. It might not happen. But I really don't want to offer any kind of suggestions that would say we need to manipulate that right now. Okay? if indeed we don't see that blue line, you know, trending toward that black line, we will come back and say in November, we got to fix this, because this type of a trajectory does not work. Going toward that red line like that and watching it dip into the red zone is not good and not appropriate. Make sense? Any questions, please?
Councilman Cathy?
Oh, go ahead and take her. She might wind up asking mine.
Councilmember Pollak?
I'm curious if we've already seen a change in trends, or if we know, and especially in terms of residential. I feel like towards the beginning of the pandemic, I saw lines at the dump of people cleaning out their houses, and I just wonder if, you know, you can only do that so many times before that way of occupying yourself loses its luster. So I'm wondering if we've seen a change in the trend at this point and somewhat of a return to normalcy, or if we're still seeing increase.
That's a great question. Do you mind if I defer to Cindy on that question, please?
Carter, Your Honor, council members. January and February are our slowest months for residents, so it's back to normal for our winter months. I have never seen it like it was this last summer at the landfill with the lines, ever. We, 2,500 people a month, when we typically see around 2,200 a month. So over the year, it was a lot of people traveling there. I'm hopeful, like a few people mentioned, that maybe they've cleaned out their house enough times that won't happen again this year. But when it starts in March, we'll be able to know if the weather's nice. March and April tend to be the crazy months because everybody's a little stir crazy from this cold weather in February. So I'm thinking I can better answer your question here in a few months, because these 2 months aren't really indicating any difference.
Thank you.
You bet.
Councilman Gamros?
Thank you. Sorry, this is a lot to take in, so my mind's going down multiple avenues. But in reference to what Cindy said as far as watching and seeing if that trend will continue this summer, I wonder, is it worth giving thought to any sort of contingency if it does appear to be going that direction? I don't think we can absorb 1-2 more years of that. So I wonder, should we be giving thought to a process of, you're able to go to the landfill as a resident once a month, but any subsequent trips, there's some sort of, fee. I mean, do we need to be giving thought to things like that if that trend would continue again this year?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Gamroth, I do appreciate that suggestion of additional forethought and so forth, because that's exactly what these tools are supposed to help sort of stimulate. I would suggest that if indeed we do see another summer where 2,500 people are lining up a month to use their free passes and so on, we will need to have probably structural conversations about how it is we provide service through this fund and the services that you and I enjoy as citizens with regard to the management of our trash. And so I think if we can wait it out until November, December and let this summer kind of come to pass and see if our commercial activity doesn't pick up and those kinds of things as people are getting back out into restaurants and whatnot, hopefully. Events are coming to town and so on. There's a lot of factors at play, but nonetheless, if we see the exact same thing from last year, you bet we're going to have very structural, foundational conversations coming up in November and December. Absolutely.
Carter, I'll come to you in just a second. Just to kind of piggyback off of what he was just saying, though, and this might be a question for Cindy, but the as far as the monthly, people get one pass per month to come in there, and I noticed that during COVID, you show them a bill at the window and they'd say, okay, go ahead and go. Do you think that there was a problem at some point with people coming back with the same bill each time? And would that have had an impact if people were saying, yep, here you go, here's my bill, and we're no longer stamping them? Could that have created a problem too, to where we're taking in more than what we actually should? We should have been charging people, I guess.
Carter, Your Honor, council members, you know, my staff asks me this a lot because they think, people, if they can find a way to get around paying, they will. I truly believe it's a very small percentage of people who do that. But during COVID, I saw things I never thought I would ever see. So it's possible. It's absolutely possible. So I'm just telling you from my gut, maybe it was higher than normal, but I still think people tend to be honest about their water bill uses. They do have 12 per year, and if you were cleaning out your house 1 month, you might use all 12. So it's really hard for you to determine if somebody's being dishonest with the free water bill passes. So I like to think that it's a low percentage of the people, but we might have seen more this year.
Okay. Councilman Nell?
I guess my question is, I understand if our constituents are creating more garbage at home because they're staying home more and they're eating at home, and that's creating more garbage, and it's putting more stress on the infrastructure, on the trucks. They have to haul less, so therefore they're making more loads. What I don't understand is, why would it have an impact at all if we have 2,500 people lined up at the dump and they're going out to the landfill? Because the things that crush the landfill are still crushing the landfill, and the dozers that are used to push it still push it. So, and we have no labor in it because the constituents are bringing it to us and just dumping it. So I guess my question is, why is that? I can't see it increasing. I could see it happening, like I said, at the local level, but at the landfill, I don't understand that. You'd have to explain it to me. I'm not seeing it.
Carter, Your Honor, this is the question that Carter mentioned he has to ask me every year. And it's hard to understand, but the refuse collection business, one of their big costs in addition to trucks and containers is disposing of the garbage. They have to pay the landfill. And those water bill passes, those free ones, the actual cost of the landfill is $18. So if you don't have a city water bill pass, you pay $18 if you're in the county. And the way it works for our private haulers, we have agreement with Evansville, Mills, Barnett, and the city trash collection fund, is every time a citizen uses that and puts it in the window, it counts as $18. And we bill that entity. We bill Evansville $18 a truckload. We bill Mills, we bill Barnett, and we bill ourselves for the landfill. So the landfill, actually the lines, there was one day, I think we handled 3,000 in a day. I've never seen that in my life. It was all the way to the railroad. And they did an awesome job of getting people through in a half hour, but it does cost congestion. And it's really, the cost of that $18 is the airspace and the labor just to get rid of that one truckload. So that's why it ends up costing refuse. And he's telling you we didn't get any additional revenues for it. It's because we're getting a whole lot more use out of it, but we're still only charging every resident $19 a month to get their weekly pickup, their extra collection, and their free water, their free utility pass to the landfill.
Well, let's be clear. That is not a free utility pass.
It is
People
not.
pay for that. And it's been said here 4 times, and I know there's some constituents watching right now that are quite irritated. They pay for that service. It's not free. It's billed in, and they have a right to take their pass and go to the landfill. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that with our people. So.
You're absolutely right. They're billed for it, and they're being charged for it. They think, a lot of citizens thinks it's free because they're not paying additional money at that scale house. It's being billed to the company that's going and picking up your trash.
Councilman Kathy, I'll come back to you.
A couple of different things. One was the engineer and me coming out. I'm looking at these 2 graphs, and they're both starting in 1920 which I would have thought if you're going from there to there, the endpoints of where the blue and the black are should be the same place over here, and they're not. So that's just the engineer and the technicality of me. The other question I had too is when you're figuring your rate model on the monthly passes, do you figure that everybody is going to use all 12 of them? Or do you figure that everybody is only going to use 6 of them? But now, because of COVID, instead of the average of 6, they suddenly used all 12. Therefore, we didn't have enough money built in. And the third thing is, I believe, didn't we go towards the end of the year, instead of stamping them to a tear-off coupon so that you have to turn the coupon in when you go to the landfill rather than having to stamp it?
So the first question, I'm gonna defer to Carter and Tom about the data. The second one, we do have an average of how many come through, and it's anywhere from 2,000 to 2,200 a month is what we typically see. It's not the 2,500 a month for the water bill use. So, I'm sorry, what was your third question again?
Didn't we switch over to a tear-off coupon
that's
rather
right.
than the stamp?
So you can tear it off, so you can just bring in the tear-off part. We were still stamping it if people wanted to keep it. If they wanted to give it to, some people have an attachment to it, so we'd just stamp it and give it back to them, and if they didn't have an attachment, we'd keep it. And yes, during COVID, we just let them put it in the air, and we looked at it from that perspective.
But to get around what somebody was mentioning about reusing the same one, the tear-off coupon gets away from that aspect of it.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. You can't go use another one that's been stamped or we kept. We do have some issues with going online. I believe finance has made progress where you can only print so many, but we did have that issue when we first started. So we've worked around some, but COVID's just been an interesting year.
So a little bit along the lines of what Councilman Nell brought up is basically we were seeing 300 more coupons being used per month than what we built into the rate model. Therefore, this thing took the nosedive. That's kind of where I was.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well,
Thank
I
you
think
very
if I may build onto that a little bit, Mr. Mayor, what most folks don't understand is this business entity is charged by the next business entity that I'm about to describe to you in order to keep that cash flow going and keeping both business entities as a going concern.
Above water.
That's right. That's right. Yep. To answer that question about the beginning points, we did talk quite a bit about that, but I'd feel better if I could have Tom come up and go through that a little bit.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. If I understand the question correctly, it's why the beginning point in 20 isn't the same on both charts. When we presented in the 2019, fiscal 20 was not yet completed, so we made that on a projection based on what the budget would indicate. And on almost all of these, you will notice that that doesn't match because what's on the current projection has fiscal 20 completed, and those are concrete numbers. And a big factor where there's a big spread, a lot of that again is because we went by budget, where there's capital involved. If those projects didn't start or a contract wasn't encumbered, it's going to make that balance that look like there's more there, but it flows through the next year.
Okay. Yeah, this one was the most predominant, and I hadn't caught the little subtleties of the other ones, but when you notice my big jump, wait a minute. So, thank you.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thanks. My question was about billing on averages, and I think we covered that already, so.
Okay.
We can go ahead and pull up the bail fill enterprise. This one's a different program than refuse is altogether. Because what you have here is not only do you have the revenue coming in from what, citizens of Casper get billed to support the bail fill, You also have a lot of that special project revenue coming in, like turbine blades and so forth. That is a revenue stream to this business enterprise. You have the other communities who dump their trash into our bale fill. They get billed through this business enterprise. Anytime we are tipping garbage at the scale or from the scale and so on, those fees get brought into this business enterprise. And so what you're basically seeing is a comparison between a micro to a macro business model with respect to the activities that take place at the bale fill, because the activities that take place at the bale fill do exceed by quite a bit the contributions of garbage that citizens of Casper put into the hole, so to speak. And this is meant to capture all of those activities, all of them. We have a number of communities that come from out of town with their garbage. We have, and frankly, I hope that grows because that helps soften the blow for our folks here at home. And as you can see, this is a much more favorable response to the conditions of the previous year because of the fact that where there was some give, there was also a lot of take in other business segments and activity from some of those other billing opportunities that I just described. And accordingly, it looks better. One of the things that I want to draw your attention to is the relative difference between that blue line coming off the green line at the tail end of these out years and so on. That is an important trend that I hope you can help sustain. Because the problem that we have here is this is also the fund that we use to pay for the closure and opening of cells that we put our garbage into. So we have the closure and the opening of a cell coming forward pretty near to the out years that you see here on your chart. And so those capital expenses are imminent. And while they are not as expensive as rehabilitating a sewer plant, they do require several $1 million to take care of. And that's primarily because of the intense regulation that is, that surrounds the closing and the opening of these cells. For example, when you open a cell, you got to have an impermeable liner placed in the bottom of that humongous hole, right? When you close a cell, you got to have monitoring equipment that you're going to install in order to deal with the release of gas and the release of leachate into the earth. All of those things are regulatory driven and they drive expense pretty aggressively. So those are obviously big examples of what takes place there at the bale fill. Accordingly, in order to make sure that we do have dollars on hand to deal with those, you will note in the spreadsheet below, again, we don't take 1 cent dollars into here and we don't take general fund subsidies into here. These are independent business entities. And we have to watch the rate models very closely to make sure that we're dealing with all the needs that this type of an enterprise has. I'm hopeful that we can get grants and so on that will help us to deal with some of these major capital expenses, but we also have to anticipate that that might not happen. Okay?
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. As you said, City Manager Napier, this is, a micro of a macro, so the trend should probably match. But you did mention the wind turbine blades earlier, and so I was curious, because the last figure I was familiar with was like 603,000 in revenue generation over the course of it was 12 to 18 months or something like that. I am curious because I think the Wyoming State Legislature kind of modified some of the disposal rules regarding that. I don't think they prevented, my understanding was that they didn't prevent the disposal of those turbine blades here, but they allowed them to dispose in more places such as reclaimed mines. And so I was just curious, because of the efforts of the state legislature last year in that regard, has that had an impact on the revenue we had been seeing from turbine disposal? Thank you.
To answer fairly quickly, I'm going to say no, not yet. we still have a fairly consistent activity with respect to blades that need to be taken off line and disposed of. So, and as you may know, and you might have even seen, that ranges in size quite heavily to where you have 3 or 4 trucks bringing in a blade to some of the smaller blades that come in on 1 or 2 trucks. But it's a great business option for us. I don't like the idea that the legislature tried to alter that opportunity for us for material that is completely inert. But nonetheless, you're correct. Open mines can be used as a disposal option as well. And Mr. Mayor, that really is the bulk of my comments. If there are other questions, I'd be pleased to take them if we haven't addressed some.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, we'll move on to agenda review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In terms of next week's meeting, we do have a few pre-meeting items, but really they are relatively, from a follow-up standpoint, more so than trying to introduce new measures. The annexation discussion will continue, and as a matter of fact, the public hearing for that particular part of the process is probably one of the more relevant pieces and parts of this process and would ostensibly end coming up next time. One of the bigger items, of course, that you've already sort of gone through tonight is the liquor license renewal. This is the period of time where that public hearing takes place, and you ostensibly would pass a motion that would put those into action. And that really is, you know, the bigger items that you'll cover next time. You'll notice what our February 23rd work session looks like. We do want to follow up with you on council goals and where, in fact, we would recommend going from there with regard to that project. And as always, I like to direct your attention to the future agenda items page. That gives you a feel for what the docket looks like moving into the next several months, a lot of which will be influenced by budget deadlines that we need to continue to accommodate and questions we need to bring forward for your involvement. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, that would be anything I would provide by way of a heads up for this part of the agenda.
Okay, anybody, Councilman Cassie?
I don't know whether anybody else has received phone calls or not, but I have had several phone calls concerning that 7th Street vacation and the giving away of that city property, because as Councilwoman Ingebretson, did I get that right? As she had mentioned, those lots in that area are roughly 5,000 square feet. And in essence, that's what we're giving away, is one of those city lots over there and getting nothing for it. And I have had several comments and phone calls about what are we doing giving away that kind of city property. So I wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. I don't know whether anybody else has gotten any phone calls about that or not, but I have gotten several.
Mr. Mayor, if I could respond to that real quick. Mm-hmm. We did want to take some time in the pre-meeting next week, which would obviously be a prelude to a second reading of that nature, to go over some options council can consider. I would invite council to go out and look at the property in question, because indeed there's quite a bit of it that's on a fairly steep incline. Particularly as you look sort of toward the west end of that property in question. Nonetheless, we do want to bring some options for you to consider if indeed there's some question. And you can take that into your consideration as you deliberate that second reading. So we hope to cover some of that in the pre-meeting next week.
Anybody else have anything?
About that 7th Street. I think what would help is essentially like a plat map. So if you took the street, divided it down the middle, divided it with those houses, and then say, okay, this is how much square footage this house gets. I think visually that's going to help tremendously.
We can probably do that, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Pollock.
One other agenda question for me. On the February 23rd work session agenda, about 90 minutes for council goals. Is that going to be our goal-setting session? Is that what we've allotted for that?
Mr. Mayor, council member, that certainly was my hope, that we could take that time to go through those goals and so forth. You're going to see some recommendations come forward, as well as some informal points that individual council members have made of things being of interest. And indeed, if council's ready to give us direction in that regard, we'd be pleased to take it. We do anticipate that we'll need at least one more meeting after that time, at least, so we can kind of go over the product that staff would prepare pursuant to your direction. And we also would like to give you a preview of the software that we'd like you to take advantage of in order to keep track of the progress that we're making on each of those goals. So we can go a number of different directions, but next week could certainly be a linchpin for a lot of that being completed.
Follow up?
What?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. I'm curious. I know that there were some of the goals from previous councils that you presented to us. Is that the goal, like the official goal document in its entirety that the previous council has set, or does that document live somewhere that we could access so that I could prepare for the council goal setting session in the meantime? And any metrics and results that we have to kind of see where we are at on those goals as we go into setting future goals?
Mr. Mayor, council member, that is correct. That document is kind of the compendium, if you will, of the activity from the last 2 years. So we would be pleased to include that in your packet and even send it to you electronically if you want to kind of navigate that way as well. So whatever you'd like, we'd be pleased to provide.
If we could maybe put that out in the packet so everybody
Betcha.
has it. Councilman Nell.
It's also important that the council understands, and I believe this is a question for Mr. Henley, but previous council cannot, they can't put their goals on you. They can't, in other words, anything they pass or do in a goal-setting thing, we are not required to adhere to. So at that goal setting, we will also be deciding which ones or if any, or all of whatever they had decided before, what we're going to keep in relevancy, correct?
That's exactly right. Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
Anybody else? Anybody have anything they need to add to future agenda items? Councilwoman Ingebretson.
So I recently had a situation that came up actually yesterday. And I've spoke with the county commissioners. We apparently have a graffiti problem happening in this county. I had a shop that I've got listed for sale that they hopped over the fence and decided to graffiti the entire shop. This is thousands and thousands of dollars that's going to cost. So when I had met with the sheriff out there, because it's technically in the county, I had the similar situation happen in the city of Casper. Casper had an abatement program. And from my understanding, it was like a grant that we no longer have. So I contacted the county commissioners to see if the county had an abatement program to assist with something of this nature. they had said that this is a common problem within the county, and they are receptive to get together with all of the agencies to put some kind of a program together, match the tagging and stuff so that we can go more aggressively after these people so that, you know, this isn't a continuing reoccurring problem.
Do we know what happened with the, and maybe the chief can answer this, what happened to the abatement program itself? Is it just defunct and gone, or?
Mayor, during my tenure here, we've taken a hard look at it. For a long time, it had waned, and the reason why it had waned is people had taken advantage of the city. They were going in with a small amount, and they were procuring supplies for far more than they needed. And so we were really struggling to find a vendor that would manage that program, but manage it appropriately. So at this time, it's not been used for quite some time.
Okay. Councilman now.
Before you leave. So, I was going to save this for the council around the table, but this seems like the appropriate time with you standing there. We had a gentleman come before council with his concerns about cell phone use and his concerns about seatbelt use because he sits above everybody and he can see them. And I had a couple emails this week, and it really posed a question to me that I want to pose to you. We have a seatbelt ordinance in the state of Wyoming that the city also adheres to, that people, if they're operating a motor vehicle, must wear a seatbelt, if they're in a motor vehicle, right? So how is it possible that our most valuable asset, our children, are not required to wear a seatbelt in a school bus? I don't understand. And I've never thought about it until the email came to me, but they said, you can't get in your police car or my pickup without putting a seatbelt on unless you're violating the law. How do we allow our children to get on a school bus when they're, I mean, if a school bus gets hit, they're like a pinball inside they're going, why are we not legally forcing them to have a seatbelt on and forcing these buses to have seatbelts in them?
Mayor, council, very complicated question you just asked me. It has a lot to do with the Federal Department of Transportation standards and NHTSA, where these school buses, they're engineered to withstand a crash. They really don't tip over that much. You see it when it actually happens. It makes the news no matter where it happens in the nation. So when our children are on those buses, that's one of the most safest places that they can be in their entire day. They're safer on the bus than they are at school. They're far safer on the bus than they are at their homes. So it's very difficult for me to answer that, other than the fact that they have an exemption to the standards that we work with. So, I think, I can't speak for the schools, but I think they provide that option to the kids, but there's no way to force them. So some of them are invariably using it. Others may not be, but really this originates at the federal level and trickles down through the states, through the departments of transportation.
Well, this is where, when you ask us if we had anything to add to the agenda, this is where Bruce Snell makes his mark, and hopefully this council does. And I would love to see us put an ordinance in that requires our children in this city, in our city limits, to have a seatbelt. It's required anywhere else in the entire country except for on a school bus, and I find it inhumanely ridiculous that we don't seatbelt our kids. And I say we look towards being the first one in the country to put seatbelt mandates in our buses for our most valuable asset, which is our children.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. I do appreciate Councilman Nell's sentiment. I just Googled real quickly, why are there no seatbelts on school buses? And it says the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said they're the most regulated vehicles on the road, not required because they're designed to withstand impact unlike cars, and they have energy absorbing padded seats that are close together. And so I guess in that regard, I would just like to hope that the people in charge of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the people in charge of making sure our vehicles are safe, I imagine they probably know more about that than we do. And so that's all I would have to say on that subject. Thank you.
Just to counter, if I may, sir, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Councilman No?
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with that in part, but I know our kids that are involved in extracurricular activities in a school bus going down the interstate at 80 miles an hour, and they get hit by a semi. I don't give a shit what seats are in that bus. They're going flying. And I'm of the opinion our kids should be in seatbelts. So.
Okay, so do we want to add abatement and bus seat belts to the future agenda items for discussion? Let's take them one at a time. Abatement?
I'm sorry, I just had one question about the abatement. I just wanted to see if part of that discussion, as far as if the graffiti is the issue, I'd love to explore other alternatives. I know some communities have graffiti walls where community members are allowed to just paint as they please, and so I'd love to explore some alternatives as well. Thank you.
Okay, so graffiti abatement / graffiti walls. Yeah. Everybody good with that?
I just don't think it needs to be on private property.
Okay, so if we can add that to a future agenda item, and then bus, seatbelts and buses.
Before you bring that one, can I ask the chief for his opinion on what I'm asking for?
Chief?
Mayor, Councilman, I am 100% grateful that Google confirmed what I said. So always gets nervous when somebody says, well, I just Googled it. So, you'd be hard pressed to tell me, to have me say that I did not agree with the safety of our children is important. I have to focus my enforcement efforts on areas where I can make a difference. Recently I provided information to council on traffic safety. We absolutely are trying to concentrate our efforts on where we can make a difference. And sometimes it's tempting to look at areas where we're not going to make a difference. So now having said that, I've tried to dodge your question a little bit. If were I to say, hey, it's just not worth time, and then next week we had that horrible tragedy that we can't predict, we can't anticipate, we would look remiss if we had the opportunity to discuss this and I shot it down. So I'm not opposed to the research, but I do, on a daily basis, I concentrate our limited resources where they make the most impact, and I'm forced to do that on a wide variety of topics, and so people can come to me all the time and say, hey, there's a problem. Can you fix that by throwing attention at it? And the answer is yes, I can. Which one of these do you want me to stop? Do you want your police officers to stop doing so that we can concentrate on that one? So I make tough decisions on a daily basis on the prioritization of our resources. And I would tell you that I sat through the original training of the worst DUI crash in United States history was a DUI driver that hit a bus. And I specifically attended that 2-day training to review that. In reality, the buses, they're well designed, they're heavily regulated, and they are designed to really, it takes that major incident at higher speeds for it to really make an impact where kids are not, more than just the scrapes and a bruise, where they're actually injured severely. So the deaths that occur are extremely rare. And part of the memorandum that I provided to the council's packet was those rare infrequent occurrences. They're really hard to stop because they're usually such an aberration. We can't, enforcement really doesn't work. I dodged that.
That's fair. You just have to understand, I'm more passionate about it. My cousin, my very best friend, was killed on a school bus when she got hit by a drunk driver, actually, in the city. And it just sent her flying, and she's gone. I mean, it happens, and I was young then, and maybe they're built better now than they were then, but it's always been a point of contention to me, if I have to get in my car, and I'm not asking the police to enforce it, I'm just saying, if I gotta get in my car and strap on a seatbelt, my kids should be seatbelted. You know, they go around a corner, we're out on the I-25's right here, the buses go out there. It just seems really odd to me that we don't protect our kids. I don't know, it's just a.
I get where you're coming from, and I agree somewhat, but I would also say that if the Federal Transportation Administration says that these buses are built and equipped properly, that they don't need seatbelts, and then I would defer back to them. And then the flip side of that is that if you did pass something, what's the cost back to, and we can have the argument all day long, the cost of putting seatbelts in a bus compared to the cost of losing a life. And that's not where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with it is, what's the cost of outfitting every one of the buses that we have? And then any of the other schools that travel to our community to participate in sports, are they required to have it? And it just has that trickle-down effect to it, that it's very costly. You're putting a cost back onto the school districts and everybody to adhere to it. So I think it's a bigger animal to tackle than just, hey, we're gonna pass ordinance for the city and make people have
And I
seatbelts in buses.
I do understand that part of it, but when it comes to the feds, though, I refer back to Mr. Johnson, you know, with the, and we just passed an ordinance here within our city for 21 years old to align ourselves with the state, and just because the state said so, and you know, there's a lot of people that are really angry with us for doing that, and it's like, we're just trying to get in line with the big dogs, you know what I mean? Seems like everybody follows them, whether it's right or wrong, so, I don't know.
Chief?
Mayor, thank you. Council, I just wanted to try to put context on this conversation. I think it's an important conversation, but I think the venue for this conversation is with the school district. They're the ones that set the policy of conduct on those buses. As a police officer, I would not be able to see whether or not kids were restrained in there. So, you know, we don't want to convey the you know, police officers boarding the bus to inspect for compliance on it. I think the proper venue is within school district policy of, if you want to ride on our bus, you will wear a seatbelt. That empowers the school bus driver to enforce that. So the school district itself is the proper venue, in my opinion.
Then I would ask you to take it off of our agenda, and I can promise you that I will have an appointment with the school board to take it up with them, if that's okay with everybody.
Okay. Anything else on the agenda? Thank you, Chief. All right, legislative review, Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, we are kind of moving into the interim period between sessions, if you will, in this oddly scheduled legislative season. And so while we are heavily talking about direct distribution, we're heavily talking about diversifying tax base potentially. We're talking about fire pension a lot. I don't have any real conclusive information to share or report other than to say these kinds of topics are ongoing and happening regularly.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, we'll go council around the table. Councilwoman Ingebretson.
I have nothing else. Thank you.
Okay, Councilman Johnson? Councilman Gamroth?
I apologize. I know we're past agenda review. I do have something to say. I'll make it real quick. It's all written, so you won't have to listen to me ranting. So I did want to vocalize just a couple of the things that I had stated on my council Facebook page, but for the people that might not be followers, I go into a little bit greater length there if you're interested in learning more. But pertains to my vote last week on the consent agenda as it pertained to the DEA funding. I didn't get a chance to talk to the chief as I had hoped. Again, not understanding kind of the procedural intricacies. I also didn't understand I could vote nay on specific items as Councilman Johnson and Councilwoman Pollock did. So just wanted to say that I do regret that vote in the sense that I had hoped to gain more information before making a vote, was caught a little bit off guard, not understanding the procedures, and So ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't believe taxpayer dollars at the city, state, or federal level are used well to fight the eradication and suppression of illicit cannabis, especially considering the fact that this new presidential administration could potentially explore legalizing it or rescheduling it. In regards to the prostitution ordinance, I personally don't mind the discussion of sex work. I think there's a lot of stigma associated to it that's unfair, unwarranted, and prevents us from having meaningful discussion about it. But unfortunately, it is pretty taboo and creates fodder for some clickbait news headlines, some bad, pretty low-effort memes, in my opinion, from some of the less clever members of our community, but also some really funny roasts. I don't know if you guys caught it, but we actually made the free wings and hot beer, free beer and hot wings radio program. So we did last week. They spent a few minutes ribbing me, among other things, in part for this TV dinner tray, I think they called it, which I would totally agree with them, is comical. I believe they made reference to me looking like I just got out of high school, this huge guy stooping over this tiny desk. And I would agree. It's pretty hard to look dignified up here using this thing. So if you're a VIP of their program, or if you have access to that, I'd encourage you to check it out. I thought it was really funny, even if it was a little bit at my expense. But jokes aside, this was to me an issue about protecting individual liberties. We're tasked with balancing the need to reinforce or fill holes in our municipal code. The holes that, if filled, could benefit the common good, but we're balancing that with the responsibility to protect personal freedoms, and it's no easy task. There's no clear-cut right or wrong answers. Ideally, we would have caught this oversight earlier, sure, but I still think, and I think the majority of Casper would agree with me, that this amendment is something worth correcting, so not going to apologize for it or be made to feel ashamed of it. I'm certainly more aware now of the weight of my language and my behavior. It freaked me out a little bit thinking that I might end up on a national radio program for some of the silly things I might say here. So I'm going to be a little bit more aware of that in the future. But this is mostly online, but we do have some folks in our community whose sole purpose appears to be giving people like us grief for doing what we can to make this a better place to live. And to quote Teddy Roosevelt, complaining without posing a solution, that's just called whining. I think most of us are completely open to taking a call or responding to an email if you have ideas on how we can draft more refined ordinances. I also think most of us want the public to hold us more accountable by following these issues and giving truly constructive criticism about the things we can be doing better as your representatives. You can provide this input at the beginning of any regular city council meeting. You can reach out to any of us by phone or email. As I've said earlier, I have a Facebook page that you can follow for updates or ask questions. I also have the equipment now to begin experimenting with some of the other things that I had in mind for outreach to the community. And once things settle down kind of on the COVID front, people are more comfortable getting out and about, I plan to continue the Coffee with a Councilman style events. So if you choose not to take me up on those offers or the rest of council, up on these opportunities for engagement or education, that's totally fine. But if you are going to go out of your way to give us up here a hard time about the decisions we're making, I just ask that you have the courtesy to inform yourself a little bit before lobbing insults about things that you just read in a headline. I wish the items we discussed were simple enough to be digested in 140 characters or less, but unfortunately they're often a lot more complex and nuanced than they may appear on the surface. And we are elected your officials, but of course we are only human. So thank you for entertaining me. Appreciate it.
All right, Councilman now.
Thank you, sir. I guess the first thing I want to do is thank Mr. Gamroth for that, because you took a little heat off me. The press hasn't been real kind to me either. So, first thing I want to do is thank our IT department for getting our monitors working. That's been a blessing. We haven't had them for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's nice for me to be able to see without having to flip around. So thank them for that. I also want to thank the council for their openness and willingness to form a committee to look at the police department. I know it's going to be a booger, and it's going to, but there are some good things that can happen, and there's ways to pay for it. And I think the public will end up being quite satisfied when we're done. We have an influx of people moving here. I listed my house and sold it in 8 hours. And from what I understand, I don't know if this is exact, so don't quote me, but I believe we have a 20% influx of home buyers that are from out of state. So we have a lot of new people moving in, which is going to put more strain on our infrastructure, our police departments, and everything. So, but it also brings maybe some new employment opportunities and tax base for us too. So it's not all negative. Lastly, I did not see on the future agenda my concern about switching or swapping our council meetings with our work sessions so that we can be opposite of the county in order to allow our constituents to be up to speed on everything with the city of Casper and the county. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, Carter, but I didn't see it. And with that, I thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, it is scheduled for March 2nd in the pre-meeting.
Okay, thank you so much. And finally, I will be gone next week. I'm sure that'll give you all a breath of fresh air. You can get out of here early without me asking all my questions. So I appreciate all your patience with me and some of the newer people that are just trying to get up to speed, so.
Councilmember Pollock.
I don't have anything tonight.
Okay, Councilman Kathy.
Move to adjourn? Oh.
Nothing. Okay, and the only thing I have is, looking forward, looks like, you know, we're starting to get back to a little bit of normal. We got a couple concerts coming to the event center. So that's positive. Looks like we got some of the state high school events coming back here. Testing's going down, hospitalization's going down, positivity going up. So, that's about all I've got for tonight, so.
Before you adjourn, do you know when the next, do you know when the next mandates come out or lifts? I know we're at 250 people right now. I know some states are going to just eradicating all mandates. Do you know when our next situation is?
I thought that it was supposed to be next week, not this week, I believe. I could find out for you, and we could pass it on, but I thought it was supposed to be next week.
Well, hopefully, cooler heads will prevail with the way we're going and just open this thing up and let people start living again. Thank you.
Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody.